Hey, sovereign wealth builders, Simon Dixon here, and welcome to another episode of Simon Dixon Live. Today, we're going to be discussing what nobody else is able to discuss because everybody seems to have a completely inaccurate version of history. And I'm going to put it all together for you. The real topic that we're going to be discussing today, from both a Bitcoin technical side and kind of a macro and geopolitical side, is really understanding and answering the question, honestly, was Bitcoin hijacked? And we're going to do this in 3 parts today. So enjoy the show. We're going to go through real stories from real things that happened, and we're going to debate it as well. So we're going to bring in other people for other sides of the story. But once and for all, I wanted the definitive guide so that when everyone asks me this, I can point them to a complete definitive guide on whether Bitcoin was hijacked or not. So in part 1, we're going to answer that question. And we're going to go through the different infiltration operations. And I'm going to attempt to explain it from my perspective of what those infiltration operations were aiming to achieve and whether they achieved it or not. In the second half, part 2, I'm going to be actually debating. We did a pre-recorded debate with the co-author of Hijacking Bitcoin, and that is Steve Patterson. He wrote it with Roger Ver, and we're going to be going through both Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash, not from the debate of whether it's Bitcoin or Bitcoin Cash, but from the perspective of whether they were infiltrated or not. Because what you're seeing right now is everybody's trying to take their narrative and tell half the story. But when you understand what we cover in part 1, you'll understand the debate. And then in part 3, we're going to bring it right up to today. And this has been a very frequently requested debate that people wanted me to do some content on. But I'm going to be bringing it up to the current debate between Knots and Core, which is going to be going through Bitcoin's next governance war that we're currently in. It consists of Core version 30 and BIP 110. But I don't want to go geeky. I want to go from the higher level so that non-technical people can understand what's going on here, and also how you can find out more if you want to go deep into the technicals. So without further ado, let's get started with part 1. Was Bitcoin hijacked? And let's look at the infiltration operations and expose them for what they actually were. So to answer the question, spoiler alert, I'll just give you the answer right up front. Bitcoin wasn't hijacked, but it continues to have multiple hijack attempts at it. It has always been attempted to be hijacked. In fact, I think the original Bitcoin was a hijack of a project that was meant to be centralized, that wasn't meant to be open source, and was meant to be a central bank digital currency. So right from the beginning, Bitcoin was a hijack project. I personally believe it hijacked what was later created from DigiCash, and DigiCash was the precursor to Bitcoin, created by David Chom, and he tried to create private transactions on top of the legacy banking system. And obviously the legacy banking system meant that he had to shut down because he had to meet all of the regulatory requirements, and regulations hijack the business so that you can't have private transactions. And so David Chom, I believe, hired a group of people, or David Chom went to a university in Netherlands. Interestingly, Netherlands was the creator of capitalism as we know it today, with the Dutch East India Company, the Amsterdam Central Bank, and the kind of the enforcement of borders and stock markets that we know of today, and bond markets that we know of today. And Netherlands was also the country that is implementing a unrealized gains wealth tax at the moment, which I've been covering on previous episodes. So 36% is meant to be charged on people's Bitcoin or people's assets or their private equity or their real estate if it gets past Senate. I think it went through the Congress side or the equivalent in Amsterdam. But it was when David Chom was teaching at a university, he had a student called Len Sassaman. And I believe Len Sassaman was the person that was under the alias of Satoshi Nakamoto. I've covered that in previous episodes, and we'll visit that a little bit in the debate today. The first one to receive a transaction and mine was Hal Finney. And then the first developer to take on the project was Gavin Andreessen later as well. And so we're going to go through all of those. But what did they actually create in order to understand whether Bitcoin was hijacked? So it was originally, from my perspective, a hijack of another project. The white paper came out in 2008. The first code was written in 2009, and the first block was mined in 2009 in January. But there were three parts to Bitcoin that was simultaneously created. And it started as a very centralized project because he had to get adoption, or Satoshi had to get adoption in three different ways. The first thing is it needed developers. And so there was, Satoshi, and then there was the early developers, and then the community grew, and governance had to be put into that development structure. And what was their job? Their job was to maintain the code, and is an open source code. People could suggest Bitcoin improvement proposals. And because it was open source, anyone could contribute. Anybody could add some code, and it would have to go through a code review process. And this was the ecosystem that was built up around developers. What was the second part of Bitcoin? Well, the second part was miners. So in the absence of a central bank or a commercial bank to create digital currency as they do right now, you needed miners. And what did the miners do? Well, they added blocks to a chain of blocks. And so the first block was in January 2009. And every 10 minutes, approximately, you get a new block that is added to that chain. And all of the different transactions that happen on the Bitcoin network are packaged up into these blocks. And every 10 minutes, a bunch of miners compete in order to add that block to the chain. And if they successfully add that block to the chain, they get a block reward and any transaction fees that people paid in order to later came in order to get their transactions through faster. Now, that transaction fee model arose as a result of what we're debating today, which is that you can have, if transactions cost nothing, then people can start filling up these blocks with all sorts of spam. And people developed gambling services on top of the Bitcoin blockchain so you could have immutable records. And they created all sorts of things to today where you have NFTs and non-fungible tokens and tokens built on top of Bitcoin. But all of those are essentially non-monetary transactions. And so in order to have a check and control upon those miners adding blocks, you had a third part of the ecosystem, which is nodes. What do the nodes do? Well, they accept the block. So the miners mine the block included in the chain, but you have to get it accepted by nodes. And there can be as many nodes as anyone that wants to run a node. And what they do when they run a node, they essentially run the entire history of the Bitcoin blockchain. They download it onto their hardware, and they provide a vital part of the ecosystem of verifying their own transactions as a reward, but everybody else's transactions and backing it up on a chain, and backing all those transactions up. And so with these three different parts of the ecosystems, originally it was very, very centralized. You had the same people that were involved in coding, the same people that were involved in mining, and the same people that were running nodes. And the job was, when nobody was looking through this immaculate conception, when there was no price and no one was speculating and no one cared about the project, to get more and more people interested through economic incentives and game theory into mining, running nodes, and developing code. And that became the network that we call Bitcoin today. Now, every single one of those parts of the ecosystem, just like Bitcoin hijacked a project, there were intelligence agencies and very, very different forces that would try and hijack all of those parts of the ecosystem. But the idea was that as long as there were checks and balances on each part of the ecosystem, and it would grow to more and more miners, more and more hash power, more and more nodes, and more developers contributing, then eventually you would hit a stage where it requires a consensus mechanism in order to get changes and to essentially hijack the entire system. And so the very first strategy of hijack, let's call it strategy one, was, I believe, the developer infiltration. And so there were attempts to infiltrate developers. Firstly, people would put up QR codes and fund developers. Now, if people were funding those developers, maybe they would ask for things to be included in that code. Then a company called BitPay came along and said, hey, I'll fund the developers, and they may have a corporate agenda. So BitPay started paying the developers, and they wanted transactions to be cheap. And so they may have influence over those developers. Then the Bitcoin Foundation was created, that created a network of important people, important companies, important miners. And that was tried to be infiltrated. Eventually, you had colleges, universities, organizations, Blockstream, Chain Code Labs, lots of different decentralized network of funders who all agenda and would all try and infiltrate developers in order to hijack Bitcoin to achieve what they ultimately wanted to achieve. I also believe that there was infiltration at both potential, those connected to intelligence operations and those connected to Silicon Valley. So what we have seen recently, and I've been covering at great length, is that Jeffrey Epstein in 2011 tried to figure out and infiltrate and hijack who all the different developers were. We also had Reid Hoffman, the creator of LinkedIn, that tried to infiltrate, invest, and figure out who all the developers were. We also had Peter Thiel that communicated with Jeffrey Epstein in 2014 in order to try and do a destabilization and discredit Bitcoin by creating an internal civil war between those that believed it was a medium of exchange or a currency and those that wanted to use it as a store of value and and digital gold effectively. That heated up at various other parts. And I believe there were infiltration and hijack attempt operations. What else did they try and do? Well, strategy two was to try and divide and conquer, as I said. Between 2015 and 2017, after in 2014, and we'll go through more of the details in the debate as well, we had the infamous scaling debate. This was a Blocksize War debate, which divided the community into different factions. Companies had to decide who they wanted to back. Developers had to decide what stance they took. Miners needed to decide what they wanted. And nodes needed to play their part as well in deciding what the future of Bitcoin was and what changes and how we actually scale. And so what this operation did is it effectively pitted the miners against the developers and against the nodes. And at different times, they all played their different role. And they all tried to hijack Bitcoin for what they believed to be the right direction to move forward. Some of them believed in digital gold and having Bitcoin as a store of value because there were only ever going to be 21 million Bitcoins. And as long as that never changes, then the idea is as it gets more adoption, the only way to get more Bitcoin is to buy them and the price goes up over time. Austrian economics, supply and demand 101. Others wanted it to be digital cash and a medium of exchange. So if you are spending, Gresham's law states that if you're spending Bitcoin as money, you're going to choose the money that you think will go down in value, which is why people spend fiat currency. But you probably won't spend the money that you think is going to go up in value. And so this whole Gresham's law turned into a debate. Now, in order to try and attack and when spammers try to hijack Bitcoin by including many different non-monetary transactions into the chain, there was a fee market developed. And so the more people that wanted to have their transactions included in a block, you had to pay a fee. And if you have to pay a fee, it goes to miners. It helps in the future when there's no block rewards because all the Bitcoins are mined. And if you want to get a faster transaction, there was a feature developed called replace by fee. Now, some people that had a different vision for Bitcoin thought that that was the hijacking of Bitcoin. Others that wanted to increase the block size, it meant it had side effects. What were those side effects? It meant that if you're running a node, then it's going to be more expensive to run a node with all these big blocks, because the bigger the blocks, the more data you have to store. And this turned into an ideological debate, because you couldn't have both decentralized security and many, many people running nodes and big blocks. And so this became the stance that people were debating. And people would try to hijack it, because some people wanted low fees so that everyone could use Bitcoin to buy, micro transactions, and it was trivially cheap. But then that led to more spam. And as it leads to more spam, people try and do lots of things with Bitcoin. They'll put the whole stock market on Bitcoin if they can. They'll put the whole library on top of Bitcoin if they can. If it's completely free to have immutable records, countries will put their entire country data records and digital IDs. In fact, one developer, Mike Hearn, tried to put passports in KYC on Bitcoin in order to make it compliant. That was a hijack operation as well. I remember him doing that as well. So anyway, that was a part of the hijacking operation. And so you get this, people can pick their narrative and say, yes, it was hijacked. But when you put everything together, you realize the conclusion that I've come to is that we need to be aware of the hijack attempts. We need to fight the hijack attempts, but they're never going to stop. And Bitcoin as a project is meant to be continually hijacked. And so in part 2, I'm going to debate and I'm going to cover, whether, the hijacking Bitcoin from the perspective of, I was on one side of the debate, which is the Bitcoin, BTC side of the debate. And Steve Patterson, who wrote the book, Hijacking Bitcoin with Roger Ver, was on the BCH side of the debate. And we're going to have that debate. I don't want this to just be one-sided. I want you to see the other side so that you can make the decision in terms of what's actually happening today. So I'm going to be playing that in part 2. Now, in 2023 to 2026 today, we've effectively moved to a similar debate, but a different flavor. And I could call that, let's call it the spam debate. And this spam debate is really, should we have spam filtered nodes, which effectively filter for non-monetary transactions so that it really focuses on being digital money? Or should we have kind of, digital storage, file storage nodes? Now, it's a bit of a nuance as well, because some people, everyone, most of the people involved want digital money, but the reality is that the developers don't get to decide. And so do the nodes decide? Do the miners decide? The miners can filter out the spam potentially on how Bitcoin is designed, or the nodes can filter out the spam, or the developers can then try and interpret what nodes and miners and users want. And that's the essence of the debate that we're having here right now. Now, some people will make it look like the sky is falling, and if you don't go in one direction, Bitcoin is dead and hijacked as a project. That's always what happens. They want it to go in a certain way. The others want it to go in another way. And the ones that lose call the project hijacked, while the ones that win essentially hijack a part of the project. And the project continues, and we find the next thing to argue about. So in part 3, I'm going to go through the current, spam war, which we could sum up as Knots versus Core, essentially Bitcoin's next governance war. And it has really culminated in Core V30 versus BIP 110. And I'll go through different arguments and how to determine and how to actually understand how Bitcoin works. And what does it mean now that we've got Wall Street in, we've got ETFs in? Going to go through all of that as well. And so after that, we had, I think, a third hijacking attempt, an infiltration attempt. And that was really that Bitcoin created all of these different people that would fork it, copy it, create a new version, change it, go from proof of work to proof of stake. So all these different versions, build tokens on top of it, build real world assets, build stable coins, build central bank digital currencies. But was there an infiltration and hijack attempt to say, okay, now we know everyone's using Bitcoin and using this technology. Let's use a similar technology to launch a stablecoin, a central bank digital currency, tokenize everything, create tokenized real world assets, and you will own nothing and be happy. And let's call that the World Economic Forum infiltration attempt. I believe there was also a fourth hijacking attempt. And that was the one that I've been warning people about for a long time now, which was Wall Street trying to turn Bitcoin into a custody asset where you don't own your Bitcoin. Instead, you own an IOU version of a Bitcoin. And they will try and centralize as much Bitcoin because they want to hold your Bitcoin so that you don't own any Bitcoin, but you have an IOU piece of paper version of Bitcoin, or you borrow against your Bitcoin, or you leverage your money in order to end up with altcoins and all sorts of things. But none of it is actual Bitcoin because Bitcoin is Bitcoin when you own it in self-custody. And so I believe that there is a current operation by both the Biden administration and Trump administration within America in order to build out for the financial industrial complex all of the different financial weapons of mass destruction for what I call the proof of weapons network. The proof of weapons network is the fiat currency network that weaponizes media, technology, finance, and the military in order to prop up a debt-based Ponzi scheme. And now they're trying to prop up the debt-based Ponzi scheme with central bank digital currencies, with tokenized real-world assets, and with stable coins. I believe that both intelligence and Jeffrey Epstein, who have infiltrated the government, that work for the financial industrial complex in order to create legislation like Clarity Act and Genius Act, is an attempt to build out a 1984 Orwellian nightmare, all in the name of crypto capital. And they are also creating legislation to seize people's Bitcoin dressed in the name of Bitcoin strategic reserves. And you've got the PayPal mafia that predated Bitcoin, David Sachs, Peter Thiel, and Elon Musk, that are all building X money, social credit scores, artificial intelligence, and integrating it into stable coins backed by the US government debt. And Trump himself is creating his own stable coin, as well as all the different nodes in the proof of weapons network. And this is basically, infiltration or hijacking disguised as open source and proof of work, this proof of weapons network. And so that is a current operation that continues to happen. So we've had intelligence try to hijack Bitcoin. We've had governments try to hijack Bitcoin. We've had assets like Jeffrey Epstein and compromise networks trying to infiltrate Bitcoin. We've had Silicon Valley try to infiltrate Bitcoin by, originally when companies needed to raise finance. That was what the company that I created, and we ended up selling to our operating business to Coinbase. You would pull together your Bitcoin and we would fund different companies. We funded Coinbase, Kraken, Bitstamp, Bitfinex, Circle, all of these companies that became huge. But they, one by one, got infiltrated by Silicon Valley in order to build corporate companies that had to follow their shareholder governance structure and comply with regulations, and effectively become custodians and tools for surveillance. And also tools for Wall Street, because we also had Wall Street infiltrations and regulator infiltrations, whether that be public companies, whether that be treasury companies that issue debt and equity on the stock market to buy Bitcoin, whether it be derivatives that use collateral in order to create paper versions of Bitcoin, or whether it be ETFs that rather than you own in Bitcoin, they give you a share of a Bitcoin IOU that is custodied at a public company like Coinbase. We also had central bank hijacking and infiltration. I've covered many times Operation Choke Point 2.0, We know that there were intelligence connections to Celsius. We know that there were regulatory connections to FTX. We know that 3 banks were wiped out. We know that that was, banks that were servicing Bitcoin and crypto. We know that Clarity Act and Genius Act is infiltration through stablecoins. We know that Brock Pierce, that was connected to the Jeffrey Epstein network, created what later became known as Tether. And we know that the European Central Bank, which is a node in the Bank for International Settlements, is looking at piloting central bank digital currencies. We also know that developers of Bitcoin, like Mike Hearn, that tried to create KYC Bitcoin, also ended up working for the banks at R3 and building out bank chain as well. And so there are evidence of all of these different types of operations that I've always covered on Simon Dixon Hard Talk and Bitcoin Hard Talk that we can see just through going through the Jeffrey Epstein files that there were multiple attempts at trying to hijack and infiltrate. And what I want to do just before we go through the debate is I'd like to point you to 2 blogs if you really want to go deep into this subject on SimonDixon.com. I created 2 vlogs. The way that I do things is I create episodes like this in long form content, upload the videos on YouTube and Rumble and X and everywhere, and then I back it up on my website, and then we create a completely free membership portal in case we get shut down as well. But what we do is we create the long video format, and then we condense it down into an AI whiteboard video. I'll play some of those tonight. And then we do a text version as well. So I would like you, if you haven't read already, 2 different vlogs if you want to go deeper into this. Go to the blog section on SimonDixon.com, and one of them is called The Truth About Epstein and Bitcoin from one of Bitcoin's earliest investors, where I outline all the different emails and what we know about it. The other thing I'd like you to do is look at a separate vlog that I created, where for 3 hours I went through and answered the question after Tucker Carlson made the accusation: was Bitcoin a CIA project? And the hidden origins of Satoshi Nakamoto, and the reason why I believe Len Sassaman is Satoshi Nakamoto, who sadly took his life. And in the debate, we'll go through the timeline of CIA infiltrations and connections to early developers in the debate as well. So the other thing that I'd like you to understand, if you really want to get to grips with this topic, is that there are kind of 2 books that were written from both sides. One of them I disagree with, but there's truth in it as well in terms of some of the events that happened. One of them I do agree with because it really outlined my understanding, because I was on Tone Vase's YouTube channel throughout the whole block war debate, and we were covering everything live in real time. In fact, as soon as the Bitcoin Cash hard fork was launched on an exchange, I was on the show live selling some of my Bitcoin Cash to test what price I could get and what liquidity for Bitcoin, because everyone got this free second coin. And we'll make sure that you understand all of that as well. But to understand the block war and scaling debate, there's 2 routes you can go. And most people will take you down the route. I don't want to give you a one-sided narrative. I want to tell you the truth as I see it, and I want to engage with people that disagree with me, which is what the idea of with the debate in part 2. And so the 2 books that really documented this from different perspectives is those that are aligned with what is Bitcoin BTC today. And that is Jonathan Beer. And he created a book called The Blocksize War, The Battle Over Who Controls Bitcoin's Protocol Rules. The other book, which people are talking about today because of the Epstein files, and I believe sharing a lot of misinformation because they're taking the side that they would like to take, drawing the narrative from that, rather than looking at the complete picture that we're going to be debating in part 2. And that second book is mainly from those, Roger Ver and Steve Patterson, that were aligned with Bitcoin Cash, a project where I sold all my Bitcoin Cash for Bitcoin. And so I don't have any Bitcoin Cash today. And I sold it all for Bitcoin at the time. But from their perspective, it was where the word hijacking Bitcoin came from, because the book is called Hijacking Bitcoin. And so most believe effectively right now, depending on which side you sit, that the other are compromised. And so people are going with their narrative, and then they're taking the Epstein files and saying this side was infiltrated, that side was infiltrated. The truth is that, as we said today, that there were multiple hijacking attempts. And my belief is that both sides were hijacked, but the decentralized and secure nature of developers, miners, and nodes meant that we resisted, and we still have hijacking attempts today. But I believe that Bitcoin in its entirety was not hijacked, and that's because of the unique structure of it. And so the project today is still the most secure and most decentralized open source project that exists on the world's largest, most distributed supercomputer, hosted by countries all around the world, by companies all around the world, and individuals all around the world that are solo mining, sovereign mining, company mining, running public, private companies, and all of them have a unique structure where they the governance hold them accountable to somebody else. Who are they accountable to? As a recap: developers, miners, and node operators. And so I think it started with intelligence, as I said. I think the project hijacked the intelligence operation. I then think that Jeffrey Epstein, a compromise agent, tried to hijack and infiltrate by getting to know all of the different developers. I think the operations still continue to this day. And with that in mind, what I would like to do is now go through, in part 2, a debate. And that is with the author of Hijacking Bitcoin. And it's going to be me debating Steve Patterson, the co-author. And we're going to be debating from the two different perspectives. Was there an infiltration in Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash developers and different parts of the ecosystem? And we debate it out. So I'm going to play that very shortly right now. And then once we're done with that, I'm going to come back for part 3, where we're going to apply all of this knowledge, and we're going to give you the information that you need from different sides of the perspective of this debate between knots and core, which is effectively a competing implementation of what node operators can run on their node. And now it may turn into the next phase, which is some kind of soft fork, which brings up the interesting question again, and we enter into the next governance war, but this time with all the attack vectors, Wall Street centralization, and are we going to survive it? The answer is, I'll give you my answer, and I'll be telling you exactly what I'll be doing with my node and exactly what I think about core version 30 versus BIP 100, 110 rather. And so with that in mind, that's everything I wanted to cover on part 1 in terms of was Bitcoin hijacked. Now, for those of you that are really interested, stay around for part 2, because we're going to be going through that debate right now on hijacking Bitcoin, with myself debating Steve Patterson on BTC versus BCH, Bitcoin Cash versus Bitcoin infiltration debate. So give me a second right now. I'm going to play the video. We'll put it on 1.25 time, and I'm going to share my screen right now. So just give me a second while I get that set up, and we'll be back for part 3, where we go through the knots versus core debate.
Okay, I'm joined here with Mr. Simon Dixon. We have not yet met, and I'm pretty burnt out with the crypto space, to be honest. I've been around for a long time, and I've seen that there's almost no good faith left in crypto, and it's been that way for many years. And then with all of the Epstein stuff that's coming out and the hijacking Bitcoin narrative that it seems to be taking off, I saw some of your videos being shared around, and I'm like, okay, I'll click. Let's see what this guy has to say. And I only watched a couple videos, but what was very clearly communicated in those videos was that this is somebody who is trying to have intellectual integrity and give their unique perspective on Bitcoin having been around for a long time. So that's very, very rare, as I'm sure you've been around for a while. I'm sure you've seen many of the same patterns. So I really wanted just to talk with you and get some information exchange, because you're saying that in your perspective, we're missing part of the story here, maybe a big part of the story about what is being called the hijacking of Bitcoin, or the appearance of hijacking Bitcoin. And I thought, well, let's hear this guy's perspective. He's been around for a while and he's trying to be intellectually integritous. So thanks for coming on the show, and it's nice to meet you.
All right, pleasure. Yeah, look, so I think I spent a bunch of time going through what we learned about Jeffrey Epstein's communications, and so I was kind of going through them in real time. And I joined Bitcoin in 2011, spoke at the conference in Prague that was hosted by Amir Taki, invested in about 100 different Bitcoin companies, and so I kind of got a lot of the inside track. And at the same time, when you learn these different things, I've been divesting from Bitcoin companies for as much as I can, because as this industry became more and more Wall Street, and became more degenerate gambling and all sorts of leverage and stuff like that, I kind of still am. I find retreat in just Bitcoin and self custody. And so I'm kind of going back to that purest side after being around the block. So to speak. And so, I think it's interesting because we're seeing people that feel a bit vindicated because they're seeing things, and then everyone's connecting their experience. And I think it's best to actually understand what actually happened, because my end conclusion, I'll give a spoiler. There was a very clear divide and conquer strategy that involved multiple infiltrations. And what people, I think, are doing is they're picking the one that they want to be vindicated by, channeling on that, and then painting a narrative around it. To a degree, we're probably all doing the same.
Yeah.
But when I try and look at it from the perspective of what is real here and what tried to happen, I think the whole community was played, and I think it's worth exploring what we've learned from it.
Yes, and I think that makes the value of possible information exchange here that much greater. So if people aren't aware, just a short introduction on my end. I also started learning about Bitcoin back in 2011. I was at a Mises University conference in Auburn, Alabama, where people started talking about it. I was writing articles about it back in 2013, and then wrote my first book on Bitcoin called What's the Big Deal About Bitcoin in 2014. And then most recently, I helped Roger Ver write Hijacking Bitcoin. So also been around the space for a while. And part of the motivation, I've said this multiple places, that part of the motivation actually for me personally helping with Roger on this project is that I felt like I couldn't leave Bitcoin and the crypto industry with a good conscience with all this information. The story that almost nobody has heard. Somehow we had the dominant perspective that was in Bitcoin evaporated, and then nobody wrote it somehow. We lasted several years where nobody even has encountered the other side of the story. And I felt like I want to get out of this space because I see a lot of the patterns that you're describing, but I wanted to, it was like a voice and exit concept. Before you leave, you say your voice and then you leave. That was kind of the motivation here.
Your swan song.
Yeah. One of the ways I want to structure this is, when we're exchanging information, it's technical points will come up. And I really want to try to avoid getting lost in technical weeds, though we have to have some exceptions because some of the technical points end up mattering greatly. And I know this is one of the, I don't want to have any debates to the extent we can avoid it about technical matters unless they're necessary. But what I wanted to do is sync up with you on what you are perceiving with, let's say, what appears to be the case, that there is a rollout right now of digital dollars, CBDCs, that was brought in perhaps on the coattails of Bitcoin. The people got really excited about crypto and they're like, yeah, this is the future. And then the world that we are in right now is like custodial Bitcoin, which sort of undermines the whole idea of Bitcoin, plus Tether and CBDCs. And if we agree on that, then we can maybe start retelling the story of what we think exactly happened. So you are seeing this pattern, is that correct? Oh,
absolutely. Yeah. I mean, we've often been told, like, some people believe that Bitcoin came from the intelligence community. And I believe there's an element of truth, but not the truth, that a bit more nuanced there. I think the project was open sourced from those connected to the intelligence community. And I do think the cypherpunks, to certain degrees, work, because, a lot of the cryptography and technology does come from, military, let's face it. And so, I think a resistance within projects that were probably involved from, in intelligence. And they obviously wanted to create what is being created right now, which is a a digital, programmable, artificial intelligence connected social credit score 1984 Orwellian nightmare version of fiat currency. And that is being built as we speak. There's no doubt about that. But I do think that from the intelligence community, there was a runaway element that open sourced this project, published a white paper called themselves Satoshi Nakamoto. And I think one would ask, what are the reasons why the NSA or intelligence might be interested? One obvious thing that people will say is there's a backdoor, and then when you understand the technical architecture, you realize that's just a very amateur argument. But the other one, which I think is true, is that it's a gateway drug to the architecture that would service this digital dollar nightmare that we're going through right now. So I do think that there was an attempt to, if you look at DigiCash and the privacy options and various other things that preceded this, I think it's clear they wanted to create what is being created now. And I do think this was an offshoot from that. And I think the reason for it was to use Bitcoin. It's out there, it's in the sphere. And then they were adjusting to that reality. But the gateway drug, I think, is the plausible story of why intelligence might be interested in this tech.
Okay, let me ask you one question here. So when you say, what they're rolling out now is this surveillance coin, surveillance system, and it's very terrifying. In fact, Roger Ver, I heard in one of his interviews, he said something along the lines of, "We're building the financial prison walls around ourselves." And I was like, "Ooh, that's quite a phrase." And I see that pattern in lots of projects. The most obvious which are Tether and stablecoins. However, the first question would be, let's imagine a future in which Bitcoin remains capped in terms of its scalability on the first layer. So we end up with Bitcoin as it is at present, BTC as it is at present, the same fundamental structure and design is fixed for 15, 20 years from now. Do you see that as also part of the dystopia? Because one might say, well, in a world in which people are only operating on second layers that are all custodial, even if BTC is technically the supposed asset that's underpinning these transactions, if it's custodial anyway, you're already in dystopia land. So we don't even have to go to Tether and CBDCs, as terrifying as those are. But custodial Bitcoin is also like, as we coined it some years ago, panopticon, a panopticoin already, if it's just capped as it is right now. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so I think we got to. So firstly, custody is the attack vector, no doubt about it. But then when you're talking about custodial services, I think we've got a nuance there that we need to understand. So I assume you're talking about those that have Lightning Layer 2 custodial setups.
So Lightning would be an example, but even more basic would be somebody thinks that they're owning Bitcoin, but it's via PayPal, or it's via an institution, a Wall Street institution that owns it on their behalf.
Yeah, so let's say the unregulated custodial, which I think is a technical debate that's a bit nuanced and around layer 2. But then you've got the actual just straightforward custody. Custody is the attack vector. And if you look at the story of gold, it is that you created the ability for you to own your own bearer asset, which was gold. And it's so clunky, big, and expensive that you have to store it at a custodian. And then that custodian creates paper contracts that leads to the creation of fiat currency. And then with that, they use that power in order to lobby and change law so that it's completely legal to do so. And then you have a derivative complex that pushes people into degeneracy. You have more paper contracts than gold. And then you build this entire complex that becomes larger than the entire supply of gold in custody. And then it becomes systemic. And so, that is the history of what happens when you do custody.
Yeah, I mean, people who are calling for a Bitcoin standard seem to forget that the gold standard failed. Okay, so if you're going to try to recreate a Bitcoin standard and instead of gold, it's going to be Bitcoin, like the gold standard failed, and it failed for the reasons that you're describing, because there's a separation between the actual underlying asset and then promises of access to that asset.
Yeah, exactly. So, the reason the gold standard will always fail and a Bitcoin standard will always fail is because it's a paper contract that relies upon law and trust on top. And in times when it's systemically risky to the empire will default on that promise. That's the history of empires.
Okay, let's just hang here for one more minute, because I want to hear your vision. I want to see your vision of what custodial Bitcoin looks like, because we could say, what are the problems with fiat money? One of the issues is you may not own your assets if they're, if, for example, you've got all your money in the bank and JP Morgan says you've got $10,000, but then you said something naughty, and so they're going to pause your funds, you no longer have access to that money. So there's the custodial problem, which is obviously a massive, enormous problem. But there are other problems too. There's problems of surveillance, of censorship, which don't necessarily result in confiscation of assets. So here's one criticism, and I'd like to hear your what you think about this. The system as it is, even with custodial Bitcoin, if nothing changes fundamentally, then let's say in 10 years' time, then all of the on-ramps and off-ramps to BTC are already through regulated exchanges. So if you have money that technically can't be confiscated, but the government and the regulatory authorities know how much you have, they know what account it's in, how empowered are you just because they can't necessarily confiscate those assets in a straightforward way, but they can say, well, if you're going to use it to buy anything or purchase anything, then they say, okay, well, make sure you play by the rules. Everything's gonna be KYC. You're gonna be taxed on it. Like, what benefit of that? What is the benefit of that system?
Well, I mean, it's what does it actually do? So, firstly, you've got the ability to own your own money, self-custody. But if you can't do anything with it, obviously they can hinder that. You've got the ability to spend it in an innocent until proven guilty system. Currently, the banking system is a guilty until proven innocent. If you want to send a large transaction, you have to prove that that's for innocent purposes before they let you send it. Especially particularly scale.
Sorry, but just on that, if you send a large transaction on BTC, it's going to be flagged anyway. So it may not be that the transaction is prevented technically, although we could talk about blacklists and that is still conceivably possible. But let's say the transaction goes through, but it's already flagged, and then you get agents knocking at your door 3 days later. Right?
Yeah. All of these are legal enforcement challenges. So to step outside that system, whenever you're dealing with a fiat on ramps and a fiat off ramps, everything's going to encounter this issue. The system is designed in order to ensure that actually is how it is set up. There's nothing that can stop that in terms of legal enforcement, or you have to operate outside of the law. And operating outside of the law is a niche because most people don't want to.
Well, let's say, for example, the movement for privacy coins. Like, people think that, but people's idea of what Bitcoin is, if they don't really know what they're talking about, is like a Monero. It's supposed to be an anonymous thing, or that you have real financial privacy. That would be an alternative. That would be, even if you're not doing anything illegal with it, it would still be outside of that system, right? Because if the ultimate goal is we're going to empower people financially to have an alternative money, it seemed like a big concession to say, well, you're not actually opting out with Bitcoin because all the on-roads and off-roads are already controlled anyway. So why is it an alternative?
Yeah, I mean, if you want to be like, I know that in my everyday life, I am significantly freer with my Bitcoin than I am with my bank. And now, whether it's perfection, whether they can subpoena an exchange that finds out my history of purchases, that's just reality. But it doesn't mean that I feel that I live in a country where I can own as much Bitcoin as I want. I feel like I can leave that country with my private key. I feel like I can transact with anybody. But if I become a target of intelligence and I start engaging with sanctioned people, I know that I am creating an immutable record, and I will face the full wrath of the law at some stage, or I will have to face that consequence. Okay. So it doesn't change the law. The legal system is still there.
Yeah, I think the strongest argument there is that, specifically with the idea of being able to leave a country, that there is a unique value proposition, I suppose, in the fact that it's digital, that is going to allow you to leave if you're in that circumstance where you feel like you need to leave. But I think that's a valid argument. But that only applies to like a fraction of a percent of people. People aren't. The idea that people are going to, like, when the time is right, up and move to a different country because they fear, legal persecution, and they're going to move their money with Bitcoin. I think that doesn't really apply. That's not freedom for the masses, right? That's like for the ultra wealthy, ultra elite, ultra flexible who could do something like that.
Yeah. And there is a reality. I mean, I made a transaction today, sizable transaction, multiple millions of dollars. If I tried to do that with a bank, I'd still be here in probably 3 months.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's fair.
To prove that that's a legitimate transaction.
Yeah, that's fair. And if it is a legitimate transaction, then maybe you don't have to expect somebody knocking at your door. So yeah, I think the idea that, for ultra high net worth individuals, there's still going to be a unique value proposition. That's fair. That is not, I don't think that's what most people got involved, at the beginning about. That wasn't sort of the vision of, peer-to-peer cash that's an alternative to state money. But I could see that still being a valuable use case. Let's try to get more of this story here. So I think you and I are going to agree that there's state and financial interests that were involved early on and paying attention to Bitcoin early on, because the prospect of the alternative currency could be very disruptive to their business model, to put it lightly. From the hijacking Bitcoin perspective, we say that now, especially with the new emails that we have, as early as 2011, people like Epstein were asking questions about Bitcoin, trying to speak with the Bitcoin guys. I believe it was in 2013 or 2014. We have Adam Back and Austin Hill visiting Epstein on his island. And 2014 is also one of these years that's pointed out in the book that seems to be, there was sort of a shift in the culture of Bitcoin. It started to move from Bitcoin is meant to be digital cash, that's an alternative currency, to Bitcoin is digital gold, and you're not really supposed to move it or use it. So we look at that. We look at these emails that are coming out as evidence that, in fact, we were tracking things correctly. And there was always a bunch of smoke around the company Blockstream. That was sort of the arch villain in the big blocker narrative. And then it comes out, well, Blockstream did take money from Jeffrey Epstein. That I believe Brock Pierce was also involved. Howard Lutnick is involved via Tether. So Tether was directly investing in Blockstream. Like a bunch of people were saying there's a bunch of smoke around Blockstream. And then now it appears like, there's a bunch of fire around Blockstream as well. Is that your perspective also?
That's half the story. I think there's a load more that we get from, so we should probably go through them in a chronological order and get what we think we can learn from it. But I do think there was, multiple. Firstly, I think it's worth defining what we think Jeffrey Epstein was and is. So my understanding of Jeffrey Epstein is that there are thousands of Jeffrey Epsteins. It's not a unique case. He is a compromise agent, and this is how power works. If you want to climb the ranks of power, the higher you want to go, the more compromised you have to be, because it's a self-enforcing network where everybody is compromised and therefore no one deviates from power structure. And then once you deviate or you are no longer useful to power, you switch from an asset to a liability and you get taken out. That is what I believe Jeffrey Epstein was. And I do believe that Brock Pierce was somebody that tried to grow within that power network. And so, here's how I think it works. That if you want to rise to power, firstly, you have different levels of infiltration. The very first level is that you try and invest or fund, and then you see what they're willing to do. And as they're willing to do, you try and invest and fund more and make someone more subordinate. And then maybe you have physical meetings, and maybe you try and honeypot someone into escorts. And then as you climb the ranks, it gets ever more degenerate, where suddenly you're trying to invite them to an island and get compromised with miners and various other things. And that's how I think these types of networks work. But as Jeffrey Epstein, who works for greater power, you have to prove your utility to power. So you're always trying to bring new assets into the compromised network. And somebody like Brock Pierce that would hang around with someone like Jeffrey Epstein, he's trying to climb the ranks. And so he's trying to prove his utility to someone like Jeffrey Epstein. Jeffrey Epstein is trying to improve his utility to someone higher up in intelligence. And you just go higher and higher up. But it's like a mafia where you can never leave. Because if you stop being an asset, then there are all ways of making you disappear.
Okay, let's so we'll return to your interpretation of the timeline. I do want to sort of comment on this. So I think that's a reasonable hypothesis about Epstein and his network and how the game is played. I do think that's part of what's going on. I also think there's a possibility here that so while there might be, I don't think I would say there are thousands of Epsteins. I think there are thousands of Epstein aspirants who would like to be Epstein. I think functionally there's a lot of low-level players. I suspect that at that level, there probably aren't that many Epsteins. I think he was ultra elite just by what we've seen from the emails. I also do think that it's hard to say. So he was obviously working for people as an information dealer, but it also could be that let's say that level of power and influence is very incestuous anyway. So I'm not sure how many more levels above him there need to be. I'm not saying that there aren't, but I do think he was already hobnobbing with what we know of as the richest and most powerful, influential people that there are. And so whether or not he is an asset of an intelligence agency, it's obviously that's part of his network. But I don't want to rule out the possibility that this is just sort of the type of incest that we see, not even necessarily through compromise, just through relationship building, through money moving, through even in some of these emails, it's women sharing. They appear to have, there's an assistant that Jeffrey is with, and then somebody else is with as well. So they're sharing money, resources, women, and I'm not sure that it's all in the compromise picture. It could also just be this is what those types of people do. Okay, so that's my take. But I think
yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, I think it's worth saying, and then we'll move on. But yeah, I do agree that there is the supply side and there is demand. So the people that demand these services should be called out because it's not like we forced you to do this; it's that you are willing to do this. So there's that part to say. And if you look at specifically Jeffrey Epstein, we found who the different co-conspirators are. That was released by Thomas Massey this week. But Ghislaine Maxwell, she was the daughter of Robert Maxwell, and Robert Maxwell was connected to Mossad and Israeli intelligence. And Jeffrey Epstein was manufactured to look like a billionaire financier at Bear Stearns, but he was in fact the trustee and manager of Lex Wexner's wealth. And Lex Wexner, via Victoria's Secrets, had a whole grooming gang. And so, yeah, you've got.
And one more note on that. I think this is very important for people as they're thinking about these networks. It would be a mistake to think that somebody like Epstein has a net worth. So I think the way that these systems operate is that it's shared wealth. So to say how much of Lex Wexner's, whatever his last name is, how much of his estate is owned by Epstein, I think it's more fluid than that. So I think there's a big network all over the world of people that are scratching one another's backs. They don't even know what their total assets are because there are mutual legal claims on the same piece of property, but there were unwritten contracts about what the expectations are. So I think kind of the lines between who owns what is very blurry in that world.
And that is a Bitcoin story as well, because net worth, we think of these high net worth individuals. A lot of it is financialization and securitization. And there is loans against those paper assets. And there are multiple rehypothecated claims on those assets. And so in the end, it's not like these high net worth people, their billions and billions are in Bitcoin and gold. Their billions and billions is paper wealth. And paper wealth can be manipulated, and you can wipe out someone's wealth if they're leveraged in a heartbeat. And that is a compromise vehicle to wipe out someone's net worth.
Yes, and also not just paper wealth, but also networks and untapped networks. So, for example, if we were to ask the question, how much could Jeffrey Epstein raise in the context in which he needed to raise X billion number of dollars? Well, I don't know what that number is, but when he starts calling in those favors, that might be hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars or more for all we know. So that's not in paper wealth. That's not designated to him. That's sort of in the latent potential of the network and the relationships that he had built. Yeah,
correct. All right, so let's move on from that. So looking at the Epstein files, there were a bunch of fake stuff saying he was Satoshi.
No.
That was all BS.
Yep.
You couldn't authenticate any of that in the DOJ website. So people were deliberately engaging in market manipulation or narrative building. But the very first communication we do have is that in 2011, that was the year I joined Bitcoin, Jeffrey Epstein clearly was trying to figure out who's the who in Bitcoin. And if you were around in 2011 like you were, you'll know that kind of initially Amir Tarki got connected to Bitcoin on the BBC and media because he was a type of character where you could connect drug usage to Bitcoin, and the media loved that. And there was a whole thing around Silk Road Bitcoin and all that type of drug usage, and he lived in a squat and various other things. So and then at some stage it was apparent that Amir Tarki shouldn't really be the face of Bitcoin because people would consider him the CEO at that point.
Yeah, I was going to say there's a lot of evidence that a lot of those stories were true of Amir, right? Of it being involved in I don't know how to describe it, but unsavorable activities and environments.
Well, he would proudly say it on TV. He was very young, he would go on TV and say, "Do you know what is great about Bitcoin? You can launder money and buy drugs." And he would say it. So then kind of Gavin Andreessen became a little bit of the face of Bitcoin. So he was the first developer that Satoshi handed the project over to. And there was communication. And then obviously Roger Ver became an investor, and he started advocating for Bitcoin and became very public. And so really those were like in 2011, the different faces you would find if you were looking to find out who's the who in Bitcoin.
Okay.
And so Jeffrey Epstein attempted to contact Amir Taki. Amir Taki said, go and meet my partner in a project. I remember he was developing Dark Wallet, which was a wallet that would kind of use what later became like coin joins and anonymity and stuff for Bitcoin. And then apparently what he said, he publicly responded to this on X. And he said that they were going to go get funding. His partner in the project met him and then came back and rejected his funding. There was communications where Gavin Andreessen just said, I'm too busy to meet. And so that was, the first attempts to try and communicate with people and figure out. So the way I interpret that is Jeffrey Epstein wanted to engage in compromise of key figures in Bitcoin because it's an emerging technology. And either he wanted to figure out whether this is useful for some of the activities that he would engage in, or he started to figure out whether he could network with the key people, compromise the key people, and be useful to power in this.
One addition here. So I believe I'm going to get the timeline correct. People can correct me if I'm incorrect. This is all based on recent emails. So I think it was in 2011 that Gavin was asked by the CIA to give a talk about Bitcoin. And he makes a post saying like, hey, they've asked me to do this. This means we're on their radar. And I want to be out in the open that I'm going to go do this so that people aren't concerned about possible compromise. And I believe, this is the new claim, that it was shortly after that, I believe it was like a month later, that's when Epstein starts asking if he can meet with the Bitcoin people and try to figure out who the Bitcoin guys are. So it's conceivably possible that, obviously they were Bitcoin was on the CIA's radar back then. That's why they reached out to him. But it's conceivably possible that Epstein was tasked with trying to figure out who the key players are after this meeting with Gavin. Chronologically, that would fit at least. And to Gavin's credit, he did, at least in the records that we have, he did decline to meet with Epstein. And then we have an email from Epstein simply saying, oh yeah, Gavin is clever. Right. And I believe this was right after he declined to meet him. So Epstein did meet with some of the developers. He didn't meet with Gavin. And there's a question, at least in my mind also still, is Gavin a legit player, or was he possibly not? Was he possibly compromised? And I don't know. I'm like at least 80%. I think he's legit. I've never met him. I've never spoken with him, but I get a little suspicious vibes from him. I'll be honest. But like everything that I've seen, I think he's legit. And the fact that he did snub Epstein, to me, puts more points in his favor.
Yeah. So if we look at the timeline, Gavin Andreessen becomes the first developer that Satoshi gives commit access to. Then in 2011, we had that timeline where Jeffrey Epstein. So Gavin Andreessen says publicly on the Bitcoin Talk forum, I'm going to go meet the CIA. Satoshi says, I'm leaving the project.
Well, that's not quite right. No, that wasn't. No, because there was an intermediate step there where when Satoshi, I believe the last thing we have from Satoshi is when they're talking about WikiLeaks. There's somebody says in the thread, like, there was like some news article about WikiLeaks accepting donations in Bitcoin. And then Satoshi says, okay, I think this is a bad idea. You're going to sort of kick the wasp nest and that they're coming after us. And then he leaves. So I don't think it was after the CIA thing. I think it was after the WikiLeaks thing.
Yeah. Do you know the, from memory, I don't know if you know, do you know the time difference between the WikiLeaks, CIA?
I don't.
Okay. So that's worth looking into. In the comments, they can do the DD.
Okay.
But like, we're working from memory. I haven't done that.
Yeah. It would be in 2011 or couldn't be less than,
it's all around the same time.
Yeah.
Then Satoshi left. And from my perspective, I speculate that the most likely candidate to be Satoshi is somebody called Len Sassaman. And he committed suicide 1 month after that, after Satoshi left.
Okay, just a point of clarification. I just Googled here. It looks like the last known email was sent April 23rd, 2011. Okay, that, I don't know if that's 100% true. That's just what the AI tells me in real time. So this is tracking what you're saying here.
And when was the CIA Gavin Andreessen post?
I X'd out of the thing. Hey, I'll pull it up again while you're talking.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So that timeline is worth just nailing down because I think it's very interesting. So that's what we got confirmation of in the Epstein files. Whether we believe they are true as well, these could all be red herrings. Everything's crazy. Then I think it's really important to fast forward 3 years to 2014. 2014, for anyone that was around, it was kind of like if you went through the FTX year, that's what 2014 was like, but 10 times worse. 2014 was on so many levels a disaster to be involved in Bitcoin. And this is when I think we really start to see the character. So from my memory, I was a shareholder in BitPay.
Yep.
And BitPay was pitching for finance. Max Kaiser and myself invested in BitPay. And at the time, if you were a developer, you'd put up a QR code and people would fund and people would contribute. Then BitPay agreed as a corporate entity to pay some of the developer funding. And everyone was complaining about a company paying for developer funding at the time. And so then people were like, well, what's a better structure? And so this is when we get the Bitcoin Foundation. And then the Bitcoin Foundation comes along where all the Bitcoiners could give some Bitcoin. And on the board were the who's who of Bitcoin. That included people like Charlie Schwem, who created BitInstant, a gateway into Mt. Gox. That included people like John Matonis, who was the later chairman, Roger Ver, Mark Capellis, who bought an exchange from the creator of Ripple that was missing 80,000 Bitcoin. And who else was there? There was Gavin Andreessen as well, I believe. And later came Brock Pierce. And so Brock Pierce already had a background from public information where he was involved in Hollywood as a child actor. I don't think that, that's a bad thing in itself, but we know what Hollywood is about as a childhood actor. You can imagine what type of circles you're in. We also know that during the dot-com boom and bust, he had a tech startup that was meant to go public and then failed. And there were allegations and settlements around minors that claimed that there were sexual, I'm careful with my language on YouTube, you get the point, this type of degeneracy. And I believe that those problems went away and there was settlements. And so we know that he already had this type of background. Now, when he came into the Bitcoin Foundation, he came with money. And at this point, there were no VCs. This was such a different place. Roger Ver and myself were investing in companies, and it was because we both did well with Bitcoin. He did well in entrepreneurship prior to that, but there was no money in this industry, so the Bitcoin Foundation became the place where you could contribute, and then it was more decentralized than just BitPay because there was a bunch of companies and a not-for-profit and a more decentralized structure. But Bitcoiners being Bitcoiners, we don't trust anything, and so everyone was always angry at what the Bitcoin Foundation was doing.
Well,
and
let me put a little bit more nuance on that. So there was still factions in the Bitcoin Foundation world. So I know people like Amir Taki, Cody Wilson were saying, abolish the Bitcoin Foundation, good riddance in principle, we can't have any centralized development. There were still others, like Mike Hearn, for example. I mean, Mike Hearn was critical afterwards, who was trying to say, look, you have to have some formal industry. You have to have some formal structure. Let's not kid ourselves and saying like somehow there's just going to be this purely emergent thing. So not everybody was necessarily critical of the Bitcoin Foundation. One more question. Do you remember when Brock Pierce came in as the head of the Bitcoin Foundation? This might end up being an important part of the storyline here.
Yeah, we'd have to check that one.
Okay.
It was later. My memory says it wasn't from the beginning.
Okay, that would be fascinating if it was, especially because of the Epstein connections with Pierce, and you saying that or what we know that after the failure of the Bitcoin Foundation, development financing moved to MIT, which Epstein also did contribute a little bit of money to. One more thing before we get off track, I was pulling up the dates for the Satoshi Nakamoto emails, and I do think this is actually this is intriguing. You and I were both incorrect here. So on April 23rd, we've got an email from Satoshi saying, "I've moved on to other things. The project is in good hands with Gavin." On April 23rd, 2011, April 27th, 4 days later, is when Gavin says, I was asked to do a talk at the CIA. Now I think this is very intriguing. I think a reasonable speculative precision is that Gavin was not asked on the 27th. Gavin was probably asked to go earlier, and then I would imagine he would tell Satoshi about that. So it's very plausible that those two things are connected. That Satoshi decided to leave before Gavin went to the CIA, knowing that was going to happen, and he didn't want to be involved.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, so we're at the Bitcoin Foundation now.
Okay, yeah. So before the Bitcoin Foundation went bust, I think there's a bunch of things that need to be explored there. So the first thing is we get confirmation that Peter Thiel who's ex connections to PayPal, Silicon Valley. He was messaging Jeffrey Epstein and talked about how, the Bitcoin community is a bit confused. Jeffrey Epstein was saying they don't know if it's a store of value, a median of exchange, unit of account. I'm paraphrasing, but words to that effect. The Bitcoin guys are all crazy. And there was some wording around Peter Thiel saying, is this part of the, I can't remember the word, I've got to get the word right, destabilization campaign or something? Or there was communications between Jeffrey Epstein and Peter Thiel that implies there was a deliberate campaign in order to discredit Bitcoin. And then Jeffrey Epstein was talking about medium of exchange, unit of account, whether it's a currency or anything like that. So
I didn't know this. Man, I wish I knew this before I helped with hijacking Bitcoin. But we do have the only thing that I've ever seen that Jeffrey Epstein wrote publicly about Bitcoin is from an interview at the nextweb.com. Have you seen this from 2017?
No, I haven't seen that one. No.
Okay, I'll have to send it to you. It's actually, I can't believe that it's been hidden, but he's essentially making the case that Bitcoin is supposed to be a store of value and it's not really a medium of exchange. So he was sort of repeating the store of value line in public in 2017 when he was interviewed. So that's another interesting piece of the story here.
Yeah, so Peter Thiel and Jeffrey Epstein were communicating around what appears to be a deliberate campaign. And the debate was around store of value, unit of account, and all this type of, this type of debate. I interpret that as that there was a deliberate campaign to divide the community. And the narrative was being formed. And I think it came from Peter Thiel. And Jeffrey Epstein was somebody that was, involved in those communications. So that's 2014. What else happened in 2014? So Brock Pierce funded a project called Realcoin that later rebranded as Tether and was sold to Bitfinex. And so Brock Pierce was the founder of what later became Tether.
And it should be noted that Tether was also Tether and Bitfinex have essentially the same C-suite. They were directly investing hundreds of millions of dollars into Blockstream. They have raised hundreds.
We've got to get the timing of that right. So I'm not sure which round they came in, whether it was seed or later round.
This was later.
I know it came. Did it come seed or later?
No,
round?
that was later. That was later. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, later round. Yeah.
Yeah.
So then Brock Pierce, who appears to me to be trying to become useful to Jeffrey Epstein. Now remember, 2008, he's a convicted. He's Jeffrey Epstein's already been convicted, so everyone knows what Jeffrey Epstein's about. If you've done any, Google will tell you what he was about in 2008. And so Brock Pierce was in those circles, and he appeared to be trying to. I feel like the relationship was Brock Pierce was trying to be useful to Jeffrey Epstein as a higher up in the hierarchy. I could be wrong. That's just what I speculate. And he was seeding funding to Jeffrey Epstein and affiliated entities like Digital Garage. One of them was an introduction to Coinbase. One of them was a venture capital fund that was set up. So Max Kaiser and myself set up Bitcoin Capital, and Brock Pierce set up Blockchain Capital with other fund managers. Blockchain Capital invested in everything, kind of like Digital Currency Group and Barry Silbert. So this made up the kind of the venture capital entrance. And Peter Thiel, via Founders Fund, invested in BitPay, if memory serves me well, and started making some investments. So round about 13, 14, 15, you got the entrance of Silicon Valley. And then
another player we should mention here is Reid Hoffman. Reid Hoffman, co-founder or founder or co-founder of LinkedIn. All throughout the Epstein emails, he was the individual that led the seed round for Blockstream back in 2014, I want to say it was, and then was also on the board. I think it was also in 2014. So he is another one of these players here that appears to be very friendly with Epstein.
Yeah. So anyway, Blockstream factioned off some of the key developers and key people in the community, put it into a corporate shell, it was raised a chunk of money that was oversubscribed, and started to be this connection between TradFi, Silicon Valley, legacy finance with like AXA and various others, and started to become one of the key corporate entities that had and paid major characters in core development via Blockstream. Then we had Coinbase, which was a key company in the block war debate on the big blocker side. And then we had BitPay, who was on the big blocker side, and then Blockstream on the small blocker side. What later became the debate. So to me, there was infiltration across every side of the corporate entities, and then obviously Barry Silbert as well was on the big blocker side as well.
Let me present an alternative picture here. So the way that I'm trying to make the easiest explanation in my mind for what was happening with Blockstream is the people who hijack Bitcoin had in their mind that we're going to transition from digital cash to digital gold, where you actually hold it, and we're going to get a Bitcoin standard where you're going to go through institutions to access your Bitcoin. And this is the way that traditional finance can come in, detooth Bitcoin, make it just another asset people hold, and it loses its revolutionary value. And so when I'm thinking about Blockstream being the key player here in hiring several of the key developers that insisted on not scaling Bitcoin the way that Satoshi designed Bitcoin to scale, there's always been an open question in how do they get paid? What's the final payoff? One laughably suspicious way that they make money is by offering their own alternative blockchain. They have a proprietary blockchain called the Liquid Network, which it appears that they were trying to get nation states onboarded to the Liquid Network. And on the Liquid Network, they would make 100% of all the transaction fees. And we have an email from, I want to say it was Austin Hill, saying that he's got all these world improving projects. He's going to make the world a better place and give free healthcare to people. And it's going to be financed in part by taking a small transaction fee on entire nation states' cash float. Okay, so that's one like ham-fisted way that Blockstream can profit, is by just saying we're going to give you an alternative to Bitcoin, even though they were hiring Bitcoin developers. However, I think in hindsight, just in the past few years, Blockstream has raised hundreds and hundreds. In fact, it's over $500 million that they've raised. And my interpretation of that new money is as payoff. If it was the case that Blockstream's job was to ensure that Bitcoin did not scale the way that it was designed to scale, and ensure that we transitioned into this custodial Bitcoin world, then the promise is delay long enough so we can roll out CBDCs and digital dollars, and then what we're going to invest in your company to the tunes of hundreds of millions of dollars. And that is what we've seen. And who are the latecomers that paid those hundreds of millions of dollars? Go figure, it's Tether. And also, I just came across an article recently. I'm trying to verify this because some of the links that were in the article were broken, and it was from, I want to say it was from CoinDesk, and from last year, where they said that Blockstream had secured multiple billions for creating some type of a fund that was going to be, backed with Bitcoins. Multiple billions. Now, if that's true, then I feel like the payoff theory has a lot of credence to it, that you broke this technology, you delayed it long enough so the bigwigs could come in, and now you're not just making hundreds of millions, you're making billions. So alternative theory that people should entertain as they're listening to the story.
Yeah. So I disagree with the framing. I don't think they broke the technology, but if we look at the things that they did, they were advocating, for as an influential voice in the argument that in order to remain more decentralized, we need a fee market and we need nodes that are trivial to run. And then we get into the debate, which I don't think is worth having. But just because you framed it in the break Bitcoin, I personally don't believe they did break Bitcoin.
Let me just ask you one question so we don't argue about it. Were it the case that technical vision doesn't check out, and in fact the vision of everybody's going to run your own node, if that doesn't actually work and it doesn't actually scale, would you, in that world, I'm not saying that that's the world, even though I believe it to be the case, would you then think one could interpret their actions as breaking Bitcoin at the technical level?
No, well, I mean, we've got 25,000 nodes, and running nodes are the only people that are getting a vote in this knots versus core debate right now. So the whole concept of a user-activated soft fork and a resistance against the miners, I think, is a very important feature and is proving to be an important feature right now.
So that's one of those areas we have to have that conversation, but we can't have it now because we're going to get sidetracked. So maybe that one's one where we have to talk about that, and we have to do a little bit of technical argument. But let's try to put that at the end.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So, but you are quite right. There were different types of technologies that were created within the corporate shell of Blockstream, like Liquid. And what is Liquid? It was a federated network of banks, essentially, where you could launch shitcoins, and it was a more centralized federated network, and that existed on top of Bitcoin. I don't think that really means or matters much to Bitcoin itself, but those technologies, like anyone can launch a coin on anything, but there was that federated network. That's very suspicious in terms of the actors that were running those nodes within Liquid. It shows deep connections to banks and financial institutions. The billions that you may be referring to is that they did launch products for Bitcoin mining, and so they created security tokens or something.
This was different than that.
Okay. And so anyway, a company with a very questionable business model, brought in a bunch of the Bitcoin core developers under a corporate wrapper. And once you have a corporate wrapper, you are subordinate to your shareholders. And those shareholders, you have fiduciary duty to those shareholders. And those shareholders, one of the investors was $500,000 introduced, I believe, via Brock Pierce through Digital Garage into Blockstream. And so that's where you had Blockstream. Now, the important part here is, we then have further confirmations that somebody called, there was a message to Amir Taki, I believe it was 2014, 2015, fact check this, from Jeffrey Epstein saying that Andy Back, not Adam Back, will be visiting the island. Are you still involved in Bitcoin? And so Jeffrey Epstein was trying to invite Amir Taki, knowing that somebody called Andy Back was coming to the island.
Oh, that's Adam Back. Yeah. So we have emails on both sides of that exchange where I'm going to get the details wrong, but the general concept is that he's asking, are you still involved in Bitcoin? I'm going to have Adam Back. He says Andy Back. I don't know if that's intentional or not. And then there was a response from Austin Hill, who was referring to scheduling details about them coming to the island, and he refers to Adam in that group of people that were coming to the island.
Yeah, so then it listed the Blockstream co-founder, Austin,
Austin
and Adam Back this time.
Yeah.
I think it's very reasonable to say that was the same thing.
Yeah.
Now, what's interesting is Adam Back publicly confirmed, as this revelation came out, that Blockstream did receive funding via Digital Garage and a Jeffrey Epstein affiliated entity. They did confirm that there was meetings with Jeffrey Epstein, so it was known that it was Jeffrey Epstein. It wasn't like via a hidden shell. And they took the money anyway, even though in 2008 it was known if you did your due diligence, then you're not allowed to receive that type of money as a financial institution or whatever it may be. And then he claimed that there was a divestment process, which is very strange. There was communications around conflicts of interest because Jeffrey Epstein also invested in Stellar and Ripple. Whether that means the coin, the entity, I got no idea. But there was communications to say that that's a conflict of interest. The investments were made, but no communication, radio silence around Adam Back confirming whether he went to the island and what was the purpose and whether he was duped, whether he wasn't. Very, very suspicious that that's not being talked about. You have to address that.
You certainly do, especially when you've got a whole faction of big blockers who've been around for a while, who've been pointing to the corruption here, and then we have a node of the corruption being Jeffrey Epstein himself and this network. Like, that's obviously something that would have to be addressed. So I'm listening to your recollection of events, and then I'm going, okay, well, that seems like there's a bunch of red flags everywhere. So how do we? So far, I think I agree with the most of what you've said. So then, this is also all of this stuff. I wish could have been in Hijacking Bitcoin. It's not because we didn't know some of the details. The tether's not mentioned in the book once, and yet I think this is going to end up being a critical part of the story in hindsight because of the connection through Brock Pierce with Blockstream. Yeah, the Epstein thing obviously isn't mentioned because we didn't have any of the emails. So I look at it and I go, okay, we are not just partially validated; we're like hyper validated here. But you're saying there's a big piece of the story here that we're missing.
Yeah, so you've got, the corporate entities at the time were on the side of the big blocker side. So I was shareholders in Coinbase, all of the blockchain.info, BitPay, Kraken, Bitstamp. I was shareholder.
Well, it was now maybe you'll find this an exaggeration. I'm trying not to exaggerate here. I would say it was the overwhelming majority of the industry, big corporate, small corporate. There were a few exceptions like Blockstream, like Bitfinex. Outside of that, almost everybody else was on the side of big blocks.
On the corporate side, absolutely. So it was the corporate position.
Yeah.
Within the community, there was lots and lots of debate around how to scale, what it should be, what it looks like, different implementations. We had Mike Hearn as well. Obviously, we're talking about Mike Hearn. From my memory, I can't remember. I think this was 2015. I can't remember. But Mike Hearn, obviously, he was involved in his scaling solutions and different implementations. But he left when he was talking about his big gripe was centralization of mining in China.
That's part of this. His big gripe was that he thought Blockstream eventually took over control of the development. I mean, he wrote copious amounts saying that development is captured, and I don't want to involve myself in this project. And the connection with this mining centralization is, he says, if you understand how Bitcoin, the network, was designed, the miners are supposed to be the ones that are calling the shots about how the network upgrades. They're the ones investing tens, hundreds of millions of dollars, not like a small disconnected group of developers. And so part of his legitimate gripe was that there's so much mining in China, there's so much hash power in China. If they're too timid, either for cultural reasons or whatever the reasons are, they're scared about the Great Firewall at the time, maybe because there's some latency problems, whatever it is, that's where the criticism of the Chinese miners came from. It wasn't because of mining centralization, generally speaking. It was that the mining centralization in China has resulted in a type of passivity with regards to Bitcoin development that will break the project.
Yeah. But I think it's worth pointing out that he ended up doing a very public, I'm selling all my Bitcoin, I'm leaving the project. The main thing he was talking about was centralization of mining in China. That's not the main thing. That's definitely not the main thing. That's one of the arguments yeah. I would strongly recommend everybody go back and read Mike Kern. I think he was the second best mind we ever had in crypto. Okay. And then he left to go to R3 and create central bank digital currencies for banksters. So that was his next move.
Is that correct? I don't know that part of the story. That central bank digital currencies. I know he created an alternative blockchain for some period of time, but how was that connected with CBDC?
R3 was the bank's blockchain, and so then he joined R3 and started working for the bank's blockchain. Which is iterations that became CBDCs and all of those. So you can connect that to the whole Tether story. Okay. There was a dramatical exit. There was competing implementations, and then there was an exit to basically doing the stablecoin bank's blockchain KYC chain. And I remember I was at an event, and his suggestion was to put KYC on chain. And he came to London to present, and I still remember it very well because he got such a pushback from it.
That's interesting.
But he was pushing for KYC and by hashing your passport into the Bitcoin blockchain and making it KYC chain.
Wow, that's interesting. I don't know this part of the story. What the details of what Mike Kern did after he left. I do know that he had a lot more realistic perspectives on the relationship between law and crypto than essentially anybody else at the time. He was like way ahead of the curve. Earlier in this conversation, you're saying Bitcoin doesn't get you outside of law, and that's just a fact of the situation that we live in. He was making that argument way ahead of time. So it's definitely plausible that he would. Go ahead.
Yeah, and again, you can see narratives because we have our version of events, and I'm trying to be. But if you want to create an alternative reality to your reality of Mike Kern, he came from Google. He tried to create KYC chain. He was on the bid blocker side. He complained about mining centralization. Then he left and he went to work for the banks on KYC chain. That's Mike Kern's story.
We definitely have to. I have to update on the miner centralization thing. That really wasn't. It's important because what he identified also in the BCH world, people asked him in I think 2017, 2018, hey, what do you think about Bitcoin Cash? And he said, look, I think it's the same problems. This reminds me of early Bitcoin, and you guys are going to run into the same development problems, and so it's not a serious project because you've not dealt with the issue of how do you finance and structure and organize development on your chain, and unless you've solved that problem, it's going to fail. And he was kind of correct on that. So it's not I'm not going to say it entirely tarnishes his reputation to say that he went and said, okay, good riddance with these silly non-serious people in Bitcoin. I'm gonna go work for officialdom and actually try to build something that works and scales. I think that's thematically. I could see that.
Yeah. I think some other points. So round about this time, I went to meet all the Chinese miners. I was at like the scaling meetings, the Hong Kong meetings, all those different meetings. And I remember meeting Jihan Wu at Bitmain. Now I can't remember the timing, but I think it's worth fact checking when Sequoia Capital invested. So we had venture capital funding coming into Bitmain, and obviously Jihan Wu, from my memory, was the entity that sponsored the creation of Bitcoin Cash, and he called it Bitcoin ABC, and he had a blog of it on Bitmain, and then he later took it down, and then kind of other people became the face for the project. But I remember it was very much a Jihan Wu led initiative.
So I can speak to some of that. So the situation was the industry, the wider, if you want to call it, the corporate side of a crypto, but the Bitcoin industry that was developed at that time kept running into issues with the Bitcoin Core developers because they weren't scaling in the most obvious way that Satoshi designed the system to scale. And so there were multiple attempts to try to get them to change. They had the Bitcoin Core developers agreed on multiple occasions to particular increases to the block size limit, but they failed to execute on multiple occasions what they had promised. And so why Bitcoin ABC was created was as a backup option, just in case the SegWit 2x agreement failed. They wanted to have an option that didn't have SegWit in it and also had a block size increase. So the idea was, we don't trust Bitcoin Core developers to follow through on their agreements because we've been burned. So now we have a backup option to get around them in case SegWit 2x failed. That's where the origin was. Yeah.
And I remember it very well, the Hong Kong agreement. Like, it was, the miners were there, the core developers were there, and SegWit 2x was the agreed path. Yeah. I remember that very well.
Yeah. So, and then that failed, and so that's why a lot of people started switching to Bitcoin Cash, because that was the version, the implementation, of Bitcoin that people thought they were building towards in the industry for the prior several years. That, like, we care about digital cash, we care about low transaction fees. Satoshi designed the system to scale this way, so that's why we're going to switch over. But if you also remember, I can't think of anybody off the top of my head who was a major player that wanted Bitcoin Cash over SegWit 2x. Everybody, I know Roger included, was like, listen, that's a backup option. We want to keep the industry together, and this is only in case Core doesn't follow through with their end of the bargain. So, yeah.
Now, okay, so to recap, we got Peter Thiel and Jeffrey Epstein talking about infiltration, what it looked like to me, around unit of account, store of value, median of exchange, all that type of stuff. We have Brock Pierce enter the fold through venture capital, the creation of what later became Tether. We had introduction to investments across Blockstream and most of the corporate entities that were big blockers. And then we had the bankruptcy and the discrediting of almost all factions of the Bitcoin Foundation. So we had the taking out of Mt. Gox. We had the Willy bot that was developed. We had the fact that, and I remember Mark Capellas saying it wasn't Mt. Gox, it was the code. And so he started blaming the code, transaction malleability for the issue.
Yes.
Yeah. We had Charlie Shrem arrest. I think it was that year as well.
So this is early. This is like still 2015, 2014 era you're talking here.
Yeah. From the court records, like Roger Ver dealing with his tax thing right now, I think if you look at the records, 2014 were the kind of transactions where I think he was restructuring. I can't talk to any of that, but it appears that there is leverage on Roger Ver to do with tax. I don't know what the case is, what's happening right now.
Where does that come from?
Well, if you look at the court documents, I think they're looking back to unpaid tax from, and again, this is no opinion. I maintained relationship with Roger Ver. I'm not trying to tarnish anyone's character here. But I think the fact that he has recently, been effectively taken out for transactions centered around tax from around about this time is another interesting part of the equation.
But when you said you think that they've got leverage on him, I don't know about this. Where do you get that idea from?
The tax authorities clearly have leverage over Roger Ver because they're deciding whether he goes to prison or not.
He has been. They did settle, so he is free. Thank God. Yeah.
Great. So again,
sorry. So let me just try to rephrase. I just want to be clear. Is what you're saying that okay? I think I see what you're saying. That Roger Ver might have been compromised as early as 2014, 2015 for tax reasons. And so when we saw what happened with the Blocksize War unravel the way that it did, that might be connected to Roger having had, the US government has leverage over him in some way. Is that the claim?
Yeah, I mean, these are very weak connections, but I'm just putting it out there that Roger Ver was in prison. A compromise technique is to allow prison sentences to go away, and therefore they cash in on their leverage. And if you suddenly get taken out again, it may be that your leverage, you're not performing whatever leverage you have.
When you say he was in prison, you mean about the
pre-Bitcoin firecracker BS.
So I just want to be clear about your position. You're saying that he served, I don't remember what the time was. I think it was like a year, maybe it was less than that, some number of months in prison. And the fact that he went out implies that maybe he made a deal with them that would then be leveraged during the Blocksize wars.
Yeah, again, I'm coming from so my personal relationship with Roger is a
I'm not trying to attack you. I'm just trying to understand what the claims are. So because I've interacted with the guy, and I helped write the book. Like, obviously, I don't get that impression. I don't see any evidence of that at all. He could be acting, but there's enough.
It's kind of just piecing together the, if you look at leverage and intelligence, they have multiple ways. There is funding, there is prison sentences, there is leverage over multiple aspects that they might utilize their leverage. And so if you look at all these different players, if we're being fair, we need to look at all the different leverage points across all these multiple potential compromise layers that could happen here.
Okay, yeah, I definitely think that one is a stretch. The idea that first conviction, he's like making a deal to get out, and then they hold it over his head or something. It's logically possible, but I don't see any of it. I think any evidence of that, and overwhelming evidence that he really was serious about trying to get big block Bitcoin to make the world a better freer place. To do super.
Remember how these things work as well.
Yeah.
People make value calls and judgment calls.
Yeah.
Many people don't know who they work for. Many people are affiliated with somebody else that may be compromised. So this is how these plausible deniability operations work. They break them up into layers, and most people have no idea who they're working for.
Fair. Okay, so
the agenda is pushed down.
So let's keep going through this timeline. So we have so give me your take then. So we established in that timeline, maybe Roger was compromised and was working for somebody that maybe he was, to use a phrase, that, to put words in your mouth, playing the role of a useful idiot, in the sense that he doesn't know who he's working for, and he's advancing interests that are actually contrary to the spirit of Bitcoin. So that's the beginning of the alternative timelines in 2017. Keep playing it out for us.
Yeah. So and then obviously we have what we know was revealed around the MIT Digital Currency Initiative and the bankruptcy of the Bitcoin Foundation. So almost everybody that was on the board was effectively discredited and taken out in 2014 to have massive reputational damage and tarnishing based upon lots of different things. And so we end up with this bankruptcy of the Bitcoin Foundation in 2014.
Okay.
And the players that kind of are left over is John Matonis and Brock Pierce. And Bruce Fenton, I'm not sure when he exited, but kind of the key players that are left over are Brock Pierce and John Matonis of the Bitcoin Foundation. Then we have, this new funding route on emergency, where MIT, becomes a source of funding for three of the developers, Vladimir, Gavin Andresen, and who's the third one? I can't remember now.
Was it Vanderlaan? I think it was Vanderlaan.
Yeah. So three of the developers anyway. And then one of the initiatives that was an offshoot. So Jeffrey Epstein put some funding into this MIT initiative. Then there was the Digital Currency Initiative. And one of the things that they funded, as well as CBDC projects, what later Gary Gensler ended up joining, who's chair of the SEC, and the Bitcoin developers. So now you had funding via DCI, you had Blockstream, you had Silicon Valley infiltrating various corporate entities or investing in various entities. And then Brock Pierce that seemed to create this Tether offshoot. And then what Brock Pierce and Gavin Andresen and John Matonis and all these people did next is another part that I think everyone's not talking about.
What is it?
Okay. So I remember Brock Pierce, when I was at a Bitcoin conference, cornering me into a room, inviting me to parties, which thankfully I didn't participate in. But I know others that went to those parties and what happens at those parties. And they're things that no one wants to be associated with. And I have stories that are horrific. But Brock Pierce tried to persuade me and spent 3 hours trying to persuade me to give public support that Dr. Craig Wright was Satoshi Nakamoto. And John Matonis introduced Dr. Craig Wright as Satoshi Nakamoto. And Gavin Andresen said that he has cryptographic proof that Dr. Craig Wright is Satoshi Nakamoto. And so while you had funding, if you want to connect the dots there, into Gavin Andresen, then you had an offshoot that put an air of credibility around Dr. Craig Wright being Satoshi Nakamoto. Then this is all on YouTube, when I confronted Dr. Craig Wright, he was pushing the whole big blocker narrative, but he refused to state that he was affiliated with Bitcoin Cash, but I pushed him on a public video. If you put in Simon Dixon, Dr. Craig Wright, where he effectively said that Bitcoin Cash was the project that he wanted to push for. Mm-hmm. And then he very publicly became a part of the general people that were pushing for Bitcoin Cash as the hard fork.
Okay, this is really interesting. Let's take a lot of time here because this is where we really need to exchange information. All right. Let's say I think we're in agreement that Brock Pierce is a very suspicious character. Yes.
Yep.
Okay. We're not in agreement about Gavin. So there's two things. Let's talk about what happened with Gavin here. One, it should be noted that Gavin was effectively pushed out of being the lead developer when that was happening at MIT. His position was changed from being the lead developer to being the chief scientist, which meant that he wasn't actually making decisions about what goes into the code and what doesn't go into the code. So this would be, let me try to paint an alternative picture here and then say how that fits into the puzzle. Alternative picture is they wanted to keep Bitcoin hijacked, to keep blocks small, to make sure that it didn't scale, to delay until we get the rollout of digital dollars. They have a problem. Let's entertain the idea that Gavin is in fact a good egg, and Gavin is technically competent and knew that the way to scale Bitcoin was in fact to raise the size of blocks. So when you have the failure of the Bitcoin Foundation and you have some of the main developers go to MIT, if one of them is trying to push for big blocks, you have to figure out what to do with him, especially when he's the guy that has so much credibility because Satoshi handed the project off to him. Well, one way you would do this is by changing his position. Well, Gavin, you're doing such great work, but why don't you look at more of the theoretical side of things? Why don't you read some of the scientific research, some of the literature, and then you'll be more of a scientist researcher line rather than managing the code, which is indeed what happened. Now with the Craig Wright situation, okay, so I want to get your claim clear so that I can ask some more questions about it. Is the idea that the fact that Gavin said that he went through a signing event with Craig and that Craig had did a cryptographic proof of having ownership, I believe it was, of some very old block. Maybe he signed a message cryptographically with a key that was from one of the really old blocks. The fact that he said that means that he's disingenuous and a bad actor. There's our evidence that he's lying, in fact.
Whether he's lying, whether he's not, these are all values and judgment calls. But the sequence of events that I remember is John Matonis introduced Dr. Craig Wright. No one believed him. Brock Pierce did a covert operation in order to try and persuade anyone who's influential to publicly back. And Gavin Andreessen was the reason why people started to believe.
Yes. Yeah. I think all of that's correct. Yeah, I think that's correct. Okay, so this is going to be really fun, right? Because now we got to talk about what the hell happened with Big Block Bitcoin, because we have two alternative narratives. One is Big Block Bitcoin was always a fraud in some way, and it's always a distraction, and really the small block Bitcoin, it was always Bitcoin. Another alternative is that Big Block Bitcoin actually is what Bitcoin was supposed to be, as we understand it from how Satoshi designed the thing. And so once you have Bitcoin Cash forking off, you then have a threat. You have the maintenance of a threat to the establishment, and so there has to be an attempt to infiltrate and divide and destroy Bitcoin Cash, because otherwise it actually is as threatening as the original Bitcoin to the existing financial players. And so one reasonable interpretation when playing the story out is to say, yeah, Craig Wright was in fact an op that was designed to split Bitcoin Cash in two, which it actually did. So I would say that would be consistent with my story. I'm not sure.
But he also went off, I believe, to introduce Bitcoin Cash in the first place.
Oh, how? Okay, what do you mean?
Not to say, here's Satoshi's vision. Here is Satoshi. Here is the #1 developer that Satoshi introduced.
Oh, no. Okay, that one's definitely not right. So Craig Wright didn't really come on the scene. Wasn't really that relevant at that time. He really became prominent when there was infighting within the Bitcoin Cash world. And so the reason that Gavin was reasonable explanation that Gavin came out and said Bitcoin Cash is what it was the project I got involved with originally. That's the Bitcoin I was excited about.
Do you agree? Who was the initiator of Bitcoin Cash? I believe it was Jihan Wu and Bitmain.
So Jihan Wu and Bitmain paid Amaury Sachet to create Bitcoin ABC as a backup option if SegWit 2x failed.
Yeah,
SegWit 2x failed, and so they've started pivoting then to Bitcoin Cash. But the hope was to keep the network together from essentially all the big blockers.
Yeah, and when I had a private meeting with Jihan Wu in his office in China around about that time, he was suggesting to me that Craig Wright was Satoshi, and he was asking a lot about core.
Yeah.
And so that was Yeah, my private meeting with Jihan Wu in Shanghai.
Okay, so it sounds like you're putting a lot of weight on Craig Wright being evidence that all the big blockers, or let's say that the big block movement was always based on a false.
You had the multiple credibility. You had the credibility of Roger Ver, the credibility of Gavin Andresen, the claims about Dr. Craig Wright, and this kind of made up like the people that, and then you had this Blockstream narrative, and so you had Blockstream saying here's what the small block side looked like, setting the narrative, and then you had this group that set the narrative for digital cash. So then you set the whole thing of the digital cash versus digital gold.
Okay, so what about this possibility? Gavin didn't lie. Gavin was tricked in a very simple and straightforward way that he's sort of talked about or hinted at or pointed at, which is that when they did this key signing, the people that were doing the performance in front of him they used their own laptop. They claimed, oh, we got a fresh laptop from Best Buy or whatever. And they opened it up, they did the key signing, and if the actual hardware was compromised, then the cryptographic verification is completely out the window. You can prove whatever you want to prove if the laptop is compromised. So it very well could be the case that if we're dealing with an op here, Gavin Andresen was actually telling the truth, that this signing did in fact happen, that the way Craig was talking could be consistent with the way Satoshi was talking, because Craig was clearly a big blocker, Satoshi was clearly a big blocker, Mike Hearn was clearly, everybody, who was asking those questions at that time, who'd been around that long, they all understood you have to raise the size of the blocks. And so that was the op that they got. That I agree, John Matonis himself didn't have the credibility. Brock Pierce certainly wouldn't have. I had never heard before that he was going around trying to pitch Craig as Satoshi. That's extremely suspicious. But also, why couldn't Gavin just have been could have been tricked? Wouldn't that be an easy explanation?
Yeah, but it's also equally suspicious that someone of that caliber that understood more than anyone else.
Not at all. No, he actually wrote about it in his blog. People were asking him immediately.
Sure, he's got his story.
And, no, but hang on. He's admitted to this. People asked him immediately.
He was tricked, yeah.
Well, no, specifically about the laptop. They said, okay, Gavin is saying the such and such happened, and they asked him, well, was it your laptop or was it a laptop that they brought? And people said, well, and he said it was a laptop they used. And then they asked him, well, could that have been compromised? He said, yes, that could have been.
So he has his cover story. Right? We have to assume we don't trust anyone. That's the whole point of Bitcoin, right? I don't think that's right. I don't think that works. I think that's a narrative. That's a story of what we wanted Bitcoin to be. That doesn't. Everything we're talking about is a narrative. The fact that Gavin Andresen got tricked and he had his story of how he got tricked, we either believe him or we don't believe him. That's it. But there was the potential to either have been tricked or been in on something, been compromised. There's no doubt that those are two options.
It's certainly true. It would seem like if this was a scheme, you would imagine he wouldn't admit that it wasn't his laptop. He could have literally just said, no, I brought my laptop. I did my laptop and I made sure that the USB drive was fresh. That's all he needed to do. It would be very weird.
Intelligence agencies set up a movie for their ops. Like we can either believe or we can just say these are possibilities.
Well, I'm just saying, if we're going to entertain the idea that Gavin was in on it, a critical piece of the story that you're telling is the fact that he came out and said such and such happened, and this is why I believe. That's
the key thing.
Yeah, but he also said and admitted that it wasn't his laptop. So like it's sort of like, if we're talking about the great heist.
Yeah, but how do we know? Just because he said, that's it. That's all we got. Hearsay. But if we're in court,
but what I'm saying is it would be such a terrible op if you've got this grand scheme that's been laid out over 15 years, and then the critical trust node, which is Gavin, he really was the guy that there was a bunch of people who took Craig seriously because of Gavin, because he did seem to be trustworthy. If that's a critical piece of the puzzle, and he comes out and says, oh yeah, I didn't even use my own laptop, well, then the credibility sort of gets undermined very easily. Like you could literally just...
Based upon what he said?
Yeah, why wouldn't
do you trust what he says?
But because he literally could have sidestepped all of that by just saying, oh no, of course I used my own laptop. I'm not a fool. And people would have trusted that he used his own laptop. Right. So it's like...
Yeah, but he needed his plausible deniability, or it was what happened. Who knows? But all I'm saying is that if we're going down these different routes, my personal belief, my belief here is that there was a divide and conquer operation, and it infiltrated everything.
Yeah, I think that's true.
And some people are saying, no, those were the bad people, and the other people are saying, no, those were the bad people. When the reality is that if you want to create a gateway drug for a central bank digital currency, and you want to fracture this community because essentially, whether this was an intelligence project or not, and it became open source, then divide and conquer is 1000% the exact strategy that every military playbook uses. Create separatist movements, fracture them off, and then, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Like, this is playbook, how they destroy countries.
I think that's totally reasonable. I'm just saying, it would seem like that is entirely consistent with the idea that the op was Craig and not Gavin. So if in that story,
right,
which I think
could be compromise networks, as you come at it from every way you can. When you're trying to compromise a jury, you try and get every jury member. When you're trying to compromise a judge, you get all the judges. Like, this is how it works.
Sure, but we do have evidence of Gavin turning down Epstein. So there's a little bit of evidence of at least him having some resilience to that. And also, whether or not Gavin is a live player or a part of the compromise network actually greatly changes the picture of the history of what happened to Bitcoin. So suddenly we would say, okay, well, maybe Gavin then was caught in it. He was actually, look, the fact that he admits it wasn't even my laptop, that's embarrassing. Like, if he's
that's part of your plausible deniability story. Like,
well, okay. So if my story is correct, I think that's the easier interpretation. Then it also would vindicate somebody like Roger, because I think I don't want to speak for him. I am assuming that he, like others, put a lot of credibility in what Gavin had to say. So Roger then was actually,
it doesn't necessarily vindicate. We don't know where the trickery happened or who was in on the trickery.
Right.
The fact is, people got tricked.
What I'm saying is we're entertaining two hypotheses, and in the one story, which I currently believe to be the accurate story, Craig is probably somehow an op. Gavin was not. Gavin was actually a good actor who was tricked by intelligence agencies who intended to divide and conquer, as you were talking about. But also that means there still are good guys. There still are good guys and bad guys in the story. Like, if the big blocker,
good and bad is the wrong way of framing. You're adding your emotion there. It is
no. So
asset or compromise, and that's not good.
No, let me say why it's good or bad. So it's good or bad in the sense that if the big blocker story is correct, that in fact Bitcoin was designed to be peer-to-peer cash without intermediaries, and it could do that, it could scale, and in fact it was hijacked so that it couldn't scale to push people into second layers. I'm going to say the Satoshi spirit, those are the good guys. We want to have a real alternative currency that is used as an alternative to the fiat system, that you don't need to go through third parties. I'm going to say those are the good, right? So
that's 100% confirmation bias based upon your belief around what the mission was. And we're still in the same debate, and we're not going to have that debate. But my point is, digital currency, digital gold, divide and conquer, multiple operations, multiple infiltrations, in order to eventually end up with what you really wanted, which is everyone's Bitcoin in a custodian with BlackRock, everyone's Bitcoin in a custodian with Coinbase, except you still have the escape valves for the elites that want to own Bitcoin in self-custody. You then create the whole derivative complex and financial industrial complex that they've already built through people like Michael Saylor and treasury companies and ETFs and banks on, Bitcoin on bank balance sheets. And there is nothing unique about Bitcoin that wouldn't stop that from happening from whatever became the number one coin. Like, there is nothing about Bitcoin Cash that would have stopped. I remember very well when BitThumb was used in order to manipulate the price of Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash to try and scare the shit out of people into thinking they should sell their Bitcoin, buy their Bitcoin Cash. I remember all the spam bot attacks. I remember trying to really push up all the transaction fees, all the games that were played. During that whole debate.
Okay, well, let's talk about some of those, because those are going to be historically relevant here. Is the idea that the high transaction fees on Bitcoin, that was part of an op, that wasn't because the tech wasn't scaling correctly?
Well, a little bit of both, but I believe that there was the whole debate around spam, transaction fees, and the whole debate, which I just don't think we should necessarily have, because we've litigated all of this. The point is that there were two visions of how to scale Bitcoin, and I think both of those were sufficient evidence that there was compromised networks in order to divide and conquer. And to say that just because I believe that Satoshi's vision was here, my personal belief is that who I believe Satoshi was released Bitcoin, and whatever his vision is completely irrelevant to where the project ended up going. Okay. The project ended up going because there were an open source project with ops in order to try and push people in different directions, and everyone went in that direction. And Bitcoin wasn't hijacked because there is consensus around the different layers of Bitcoin and its construct, whether it be miners, whether it be mining pools, whether it be nodes, whether it be open source development. that we are still in an open source boardroom of the most decentralized project with pockets of centralization and compromise that exists at the level of security that we currently have.
How is it decentralized? Like, can you explain what that word means?
Because there are different parts of the ecosystem, and every time one of them gets too close to being too centralized, and there is a risk factor out there, then different parts of the community can pivot off in a different direction. And we still have the most secure and the most decentralized we can have with lots of problems.
So is the idea that what keeps it decentralized is that projects can fork off?
Well, at every layer of compromise, we're developing more and more systems like knots versus core, alternative implementations on nodes. We've got multiple mining pools, and we've got examples of when a mining pool becomes too influential, people can move it. We've got technology that means mining pools can have different, layers and different innovation. You've got multiple examples of when mining gets centralized in one country, one structure. We've got private companies, public companies. We've got countries that hate each other mining at the sovereign level. You've got all these different, types of things. And then we've got now a bunch of developers that when people draw too much attention or push too much attention, some of them lose their commit access. It changes. And so when you put all of these pieces together, you've got what Bitcoin is today. It was never hijacked. Bitcoin is continually attempting to be hijacked.
Yeah.
And it's the mess we got.
It seems like, so I'm going to draw like the opposite conclusion of a bunch of those examples. So when you say people are losing their commit access, that's not an organic thing. Like some people have commit access and some people don't. And there's like a handful of people that make those decisions. That's when Gavin, so if you recall, when Gavin came out, actually, it said that he thought Craig Wright was Satoshi. That's when they formally stripped him of his commit access. Right. So that was a decision that was made by some individuals. So it's what I see is the opposite. I see you already have massive centralization of mining everywhere. You have mass centralization of node development. There's one serious node implementation, and there's one new competing alternative. But if there's disagreements and the way that decentralization is preserved is by one group forking off, well, that's already what happened with Bitcoin Cash. So you'd have BTC, the chain that can never innovate, can never upgrade, can never do anything because the handful of people with commit access are the ones that are actually calling the shots. I just don't see it as decentralized.
Yeah, but we know that there's more than just a bunch of developers saying it. There's narrative, there's rallying, there's user-activated soft fork, there's hard forks, there's miners, there's mining pools. All of these people make up the ecosystem of what eventually gets consensus. There is definitely pockets of centralization that are less than perfect.
Yeah,
but that's not solved by someone else having a more centralized version of that.
No,
and if that project became the number one, it would still suffer all the same types of attack vectors.
Yeah, I think this idea of consensus is the word here that I just completely disagree with. I think that's a mirage. I think this is a tool. So what wound up winning was a veto power. Veto power wins, or functionally that's what happened. You could have the entire industry, the corporate industry, if you want to call it that, outside of Blockstream and Bitfinex, that decide this includes, in fact, some core developers saying, yeah, of course we need to increase the block size to 2 megabytes. That absolutely paltry concession wasn't made because hell was raised to prevent any changes from happening. So I don't. The idea that there's consensus, the Hong Kong agreement was the closest thing we ever got to consensus in Bitcoin. That was virtually the entire industry agreeing that this is the thing we're going to do, and yet the veto card was played by the people that control core development.
Well, wasn't there a user-activated soft fork? Wasn't there massive pockets of lobbying? Weren't the venture capitalists all trying to pull together? Didn't Barry Silbert try and put together?
Yeah,
like there were multiple layers. There was no chance that you could say that. Of course, core had a voice.
But there was a lot of work. So it's sort of like politics, right? There's a lot of people debating things. There's a lot of people saying things and doing things, but most of it doesn't matter. Like if there's a handful of people that have commit access that determine what goes into Bitcoin software and what doesn't, you can have all the things you're describing, and they're not really related to the decisions that a handful of people are making, what goes into the software, what doesn't. As we've seen, as demonstrated perfectly what happened during the Blocksize War, right? That would be the example of mass centralization, that it turns out to be the developers are the ones that are calling the shot, and then by extension, the people that are funding the developers are the ones that are calling the shots.
But that's not the whole piece there. Like there are developers right now that are going in different directions, looking at soft forks, looking at alternative implementations. And they're all debating right now, and they're saying this one's compromised, that one's compromised.
Yeah.
And this is the open source boardroom that we have.
Yeah, but what's going to come of it?
These are humans that are flawed because they can be compromised, and they can engage in censorship, And there are brutal games that are played. And many of those games were played, and all of them are deployed. But to say that this is hijacked and that there is just the core developers that control this project in its entirety is just not the reality.
No, there are other people who are connected to them, but I'm saying the people that are calling the shots are obviously the core developers. There's a bunch of talking and a bunch of hooting and hollering.
In terms of one part.
In terms of what goes into Bitcoin's code, which controls the structure of the network at the most fundamental level. What is including
an alternative model to that?
So that's an excellent question. And I think what we have to do is grow up and realize that you're always going to have centralized development. Correct. You can't not have centralized development. The problem is that is actually a measure of competence of the people who are calling the shots in the development teams. Competence and compromise. So if you're going to say that there is a hierarchy here and there are people who are calling the shots, that's just how the world works, then the question is, okay, let's examine who's calling the shots in Bitcoin. It's Bitcoin core developers who have decided we're going to pivot away from Satoshi's design unambiguously. They've like admitted this is the case.
Yeah, that's narrative. Like,
no, what part's narrative?
Again, like making changes was the whole debate. You know, what that is, whether that's Satoshi's vision, whether it's relevant that it's Satoshi's vision.
So just to be clear, you don't think it's clear that Satoshi envisioned Bitcoin being used as a peer-to-peer currency, even in examples like using it in a vending machine?
Yes, I think that's clear. Yeah, I think that's what Satoshi originally wanted.
Okay, so then and do you think it's also clear that Satoshi intended Bitcoin to scale with block size increases?
Yeah, I think that's clear.
Okay, then I don't. What's the narrative? All I'm saying is
what did the community end up doing in this whole open source boardroom in a mechanism where there are different players?
I don't buy the open source community.
Do you believe that Satoshi Nakamoto, in its original design, had figured out all the problems that whenever you develop technology, you inevitably find out as you decide where this project goes next?
No. No, so I don't think he was perfect. However, if we're talking about like network design, it would be uncontroversial and obvious that the whole way Satoshi envisioned the system of working was not everybody's running their own node. And he literally talked about that. It was, you're going to have big blocks and you're going to have what's called SPV, which means that you don't have to run your own full node, because obviously that network wouldn't scale. It's just a matter of fact that the network design doesn't work, and it doesn't need to work because that's not what how does Satoshi design it to work? And he was like unambiguous about that. So I don't buy the idea that it's an organic process. It's an open source community at all. We had Satoshi, who was the leader of the project, calling the shots, and then it was Gavin, and Gavin gave his commit access to several different people. Those people eventually kicked him out of the project, and the people that are calling the shots are those that have the commit access to the Bitcoin Core repository. And almost everything else is just chatter and irrelevant. A great example of this is some of the stuff that's happened in Bitcoin right now, where ironically there's a new civil war that's happening. You know, is Bitcoin going to be spamified or not? Are you going to have a bunch of data not returned or not? Ironically, a lot of the Bitcoin Core people are now making the arguments we were making 10 years ago. And in fact, they made some changes.
Healthy, right? That's not a hijack project. That is people saying that they're advocating for what you wanted years ago.
No. I would say it's the opposite, right? That unfortunately, the technical details are going to matter here, but the concession that in fact the big blockers were technically correct on this claim as well is kind of hilarious in hindsight. But I bring it up as an example to say there were these naive souls that thought they were part of a decentralized decision-making process. They're a part of the community, and they feel very strongly that op return is spam, and they're node runners, and they don't want to have op return data in their nodes, and so they're going to voice their opinions. And they were using the arguments that they had heard from small block folks a decade ago. So in that sense, they're sort of like less their heart.
One could argue that maybe they're compromised in the direction that Craig Wright was compromised.
But the funny point in all of this is none of their arguments mattered at all, because they actually made decisions despite there being community disagreement. It doesn't matter that at the end of the day, it's a handful of people that are calling the shots of what goes into the code and what doesn't. And people, talk the meetings of what happens on Twitter and the different power players, that turns out really not to matter because of the way that the GitHub access works.
It does, because there is miner power and there is node power, and that is the mechanism and the checks and balances and the system that we have.
Okay, but
there is venture capital power, there is corporate power, and there are lots of power structures and power factions.
Well, but didn't we see that with the miner? Like with miner power, for example, didn't we see during the Blocksize War, doesn't matter because we had, more than 80% of the network was signaling block size increase, and then it didn't happen because the core developers didn't code it in. So that power can't be that great.
Okay, well, but what I'm saying is we still have the most decentralized and secure project that has checks and balances, pockets of centralization, imperfect structure, imperfect decision making, but I still have a project where I'm able to own my own money in self-custody, spend my value, leave the country, do whatever I want, and a monetary policy that I believe will never change.
Okay, why don't you believe the monetary policy will change? Could it change?
In theory, it can, but there's a lot of layers that are required in order to change that monetary policy. And if that monetary policy does change, that's the end. That's my point of saying I'm out.
Are you aware that Peter Todd,
the mechanism for getting that monetary policy to change, I think is virtually impossible.
Are you aware that Peter Todd, for example, the core developer who played a role, we say, in the hijacking of Bitcoin, has already proposed on multiple occasions changing the 21 million limit?
Yes, and Peter Todd, in my estimation, is a bad actor, a compromise actor, somebody that's not ideologically aligned with.
So would it be true to say that that given that even parameters like the 21 million limit are changeable, that you're trusting that for a set of reasons and a set of incentives, you're trusting that that those changes won't happen because you trust some individuals that have power? You think that will prevent that from happening?
There is trust at every part of the network, but in its entirety and our very well-defined process, we're about to see the soft fork process. We've seen the hard fork process. And at every layer, we've seen what happens when a mining pool gets too much power. We've seen what happens when the community split. We've seen all of these different things. But to say that Peter Todd, on his own, as somebody that was compromised, could change the monetary policy of Bitcoin is impossible.
Yeah, I'm not saying that. The reason I ask is because most people aren't even aware that that variable can change. And what I have seen, empirically speaking, and being in Bitcoin,
everything can change in any project.
That's right. But most people don't. But most people don't understand that with Bitcoin, right? You have got a bunch of people that think Bitcoin is some system that's outside of the power of humans. Nobody can change it no matter what. That's what gives it its value. But in fact, it's a social thing, and all of the variables can change. And the reason I bring up Peter Todd, because he did turn out to have influence then, I think does have some influence now. But if we play out a scenario in which more than, and it's been more than Peter Todd.
I think Peter Todd, I mean, from my perspective, we're all dealing with human perceptions here, but Peter Todd is severely discredited.
Okay, well, so what I have seen is that it was also severely discredited back in the day to think that the block size limit was never going to be increased. Nobody had that position. Greg Maxwell didn't have that position. Adam Back didn't have that position. That was like a wild-eyed idea, and yet that's what we wound up with. And for example, it's a better example than Peter Todd. So Michael Saylor is somebody that has a lot of influence. And he has proposed funding core development. He wants to fund core developers because he thinks the current set of developers are too reckless and he wants the protocol to be set in stone. Okay, well, let's imagine a circumstance in which he can fund $1 billion or plus, he and his extended network, into funding core development. So instead of Bitcoin Core that had their funding from whatever source, it's Bitcoin Saylor. And then they end up having commit access. Okay, I'll play it out 5, 10, 15 years. The idea that actually, this is quite realistic. They're going to run into a security problem, which is, how do we fund miners to continue mining on the network when the block rewards have gone away and there aren't enough transaction fees to pay for mining? So that is an inevitable problem that Bitcoin will be facing in the future. It's completely reasonable to think that one of the possible solutions that Saylor core developers will come up with is simply having an indefinite emission of Bitcoin, because in fact that does solve the problem, and this is why Peter Todd has proposed it, is because it actually does solve the technical issue. So why wouldn't that seems like that's an entirely reasonable story to tell, and that would imply that this is not a decentralized system that's just centralized based on who is funding the important developers at that given time.
Yeah, but that would go through the process. There would be resistance against that. There would be alternative funding. There would be different teams. There would be everything that we've already seen, whether it's the soft fork process, the hard fork process, the user activated soft fork, whatever process we would go through. I would resist that. Community members would resist that. I'd use my influence over certain companies to resist, and everyone would do the same. And that's the process.
Do you think the network would fork?
If he specifically wanted to,
if he said so we have a real problem, which is that we don't have enough transaction fees to pay for miner security, and so we're going to solve this by having a indefinite tail emission of Bitcoin. So technically it's not a 21 million limit, but it would
be a massive heated debate. I think that it would be very, very hard to get that, and I think we'd go through a similar process to what we're going through now, where people would be calling each other out and people would say you're compromised, and we go through this whole process. And so again, I'm not saying this is a perfect system. I'm saying it's the best system we got.
Okay. Well, so I think there's a lot more we could talk about on these lines. But I want to, I want to be respectful of your time, and I'm proud that we didn't get wrapped up in too much technical detail. I thought we would. I'm glad we haven't. Is there anything else that you want to say in terms of the alternative picture that you're painting? Because right now, what has been proposed is that maybe Gavin and Roger are compromised people, and so that's where we get the big blocker thing is based on compromise. They aren't the good guys, let's say. Are there other pieces of the puzzle here that you think people are missing?
No, I mean, we could go into the future around like what happened with Gary Gensler and Operation Choke Point 2.0, but I don't think we should. I think this is the key thing. And if I were to speculate, I believe that Adam Back is a bad actor. Brock Pierce is a bad actor.
Agreed.
I think and I think we should. Dr. Craig Wright is definitely a bad actor.
Yep.
And I personally think Peter Todd is a bad actor.
Yes. Strongly agree.
And I think the rest, it's up to debate. The layer of how autonomous they are, their real opinion, what really happened. I think it's all open to interpretation. But I'm pretty confident in saying those people are bad actors.
Yes, and disagreeing about many things. I agree with that list. So I think that's a great note to end on. And I really appreciate your time. And this is an unfolding story, right? We don't know what else is going to be discovered here. And I get the impression that you've got an open mind and are still trying to figure things out. So I respect that.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, as I said, it's nice that we can respect that. And there's only one thing that matters to me in the end is accuracy. There are things that are opinions. There are things that are inaccurate and accurate. We're going to find out in the end. But I'm not ready to give up on this project.
Okay, and I am. So, fellow Bitcoiner. Okay, we agree on a lot. We have it sounds like there's a lot we're going to disagree on, but I think that we're going to agree on a lot more. And I do think it's over. I mean, just my personal opinion is like crypto entirely as an entire industry might actually be over. There's a couple of exceptions, maybe with privacy coins, but I just think all signs point to it was co-opted and digital dollars on crypto rails. That's the future. Unfortunately, yes. Devastating, heartbreaking, but I think that's the way we're going into.
Oh, we're definitely going into that world. But the question is there an exit? And I believe that that there is an exit. I think I live that exit. I think other people can live that exit. And I think Bitcoin will give more power to power. Bitcoin doesn't fix everything. There are people that can engage in crimes against humanity using Bitcoin. And there are people that will use Bitcoin for good. And this whole financial industrial complex, I believe Bitcoin in custody is co-opted. But the ability to own Bitcoin in self-custody, run your own node, is, I think, the best that we have.
Okay, one question. You say, I was going to say, great way to end and signing off. Okay, but you said, and the ability to run your own node. So what is it that you think you gain from running your own node in particular?
I think the user-activated soft fork is a thing. It is a layer of defense. I think having 25,000 nodes, being able to verify my transactions, being able to do that trivially, and back up my copy of the blockchain.
But you can verify your own transactions without running your own node. You just can't verify other people's transactions.
Yeah, there's alternatives, of course.
Okay. Well, yeah, I don't want to crack open that door because I think we've had a very productive conversation. And again, I appreciate your time. Is there so for people who don't know about you, where can they go to learn more and see more of your content?
Yeah, and again, I really focus on geopolitics, attack vectors, macroeconomics, where Bitcoin fits into the world of tech, this whole surveillance state that's being built. So I go live on YouTube every Friday for about 4 hours following money. I spend about 5% on Bitcoin, 95% on monetary flows.
Okay.
I'm regularly on X, and I've got my website, SimonDixon.com, in case I get taken out from any of these more centralized services.
Okay, great. And if people don't know, also for me, if you're interested, steve-patterson.com is going to be my website, where you can check out the different projects I'm involved with there. All right. Thanks again for your time, Simon.
Thank you. Cheers, Steve. Okay, I hope you enjoyed that debate. So that's part 1 and part 2. As a quick reminder, we're back live again. That was a pre-recorded debate that I did this week. So it was pretty fresh, but things have moved since then as well in terms of the current debates. And so we're now going to move into part 3 of Was Bitcoin Hijacked? And in part 3, we're going to be bringing it right up to the present. So we've given the entire history from pre-Bitcoin to the block war debate. Now we're going to be going through Knots versus Core. This is basically Bitcoin's next governance war. And it is between Core v30. And I don't want to go technical. I'm going to try and stay non-technical for as much as I can. And I'm going to bring in several opinions as well. And BIP 110. So this is a live debate. And what's really important to me is I want you to be able to engage in this debate and understand why I gave the argument that Bitcoin is still not hijacked, with lots of hijacked attempts, in the most decentralized, distributed project that exists in the world today, with the level of security that can resist government attacks, central bank attacks, intelligence attacks, Wall Street attacks, Silicon Valley attacks, and all the other attacks that we've discovered. So just as a quick recap, in part one, we discussed whether Bitcoin was hijacked. I went through infiltration operations and explained them. So if you joined late, please go back to part one and make sure you understand those infiltration operations because this is built on top of each other. We just watched the debate in part two from the author or the co-author of Hijacking Bitcoin. It was myself debating Steve Patterson. And this was really on Bitcoin BTC versus Bitcoin Cash BCH as it relates to any infiltration and any of the debates rather than the actual old debates that we used to have. You can go back to my YouTube channel in 2016, 15, 17 to see all those old debates if you're geeky and want to do that. But now I want to bring it to the present in part three, which is Knots versus Core, the current debate, Bitcoin's next governance war, and Core V30 and BIP 110. Right. So let's make sure that we get the history right, because in that debate, there were allegations, and I want you to see how this open source project actually works. So 2015 to 2017, you could say, was the entirety of the block war scaling debate as a public battle in what I believe was actually a divide and conquer operation. But in 2015, it was essentially, it started. There was obviously more before this, and there were conferences, that I attended where we would debate these topics in less of a public environment. But the public debate really started in 2015, and it was when there were competing implementations. And so Bitcoin Core had an implementation that was run by a group of developers, and then an alternative group of developers from within a faction of Bitcoin Core said, we would like to take this in a different direction and experiment with different block sizes and different solutions. And so that project, you basically take the GitHub code and you create a new repository. And that new repository has all the previous code, all of the history. And then you start changing code and you start suggesting implementations. And any developer can contribute to the new codes. And this new code was called Bitcoin XT. And it was started by Gavin Andreessen. And Andreessen was the first developer that Satoshi Nakamoto passed the project on to. And he released Bitcoin XT with a Bitcoin improvement proposal. When we say BIP, it means Bitcoin improvement proposal. Anybody can suggest a proposal. And it was Bitcoin improvement proposal, the 101, the first 101st Bitcoin improvement proposal. And what it proposed is that the blocks that were previously 1 megabyte were going to be increased to 8 megabytes. And that was the proposal. And so that went on its different path. And after interest kind of waned out and it was debated and everything was talked about. Okay, so we moved into the next iteration and it was called Bitcoin Classic. And so people didn't like where the 8 megabyte solution, it was debated. And somebody decided that they're going to create another repository called Bitcoin Classic. And Bitcoin Classic was a proposal that increased the block size from 1 megabyte to 2 megabytes. And it was a hard fork instead of Bitcoin XT, which had 8 megabytes. And it was under BIP 101. And so you take that fork and you can have another fork and you can update the code. This was essentially the next iteration. And then in 2016, another version was proposed, which was Bitcoin Unlimited. So this is how this project works. So unlike Bitcoin XT, which had 8 megabytes rather than 1 megabyte, and Bitcoin Classic, which had 2 megabytes rather than 1 megabyte, Bitcoin Unlimited was proposed, and effectively it removed the block size limit altogether, and it allowed the miners to signal their own block size, and they can have their own preferences, and they can use it to signal. So code was developed for miners to signal what they wanted, and those miners, we know who many of the miners are, and we don't know who other miners are. But you're able to take your investment in hash power, in running ASICs, in paying for electricity, in receiving that block reward, in playing the role of decentralized central bank across the largest network of distributed supercomputers. You get to signal to the network what your preference is. And so this introduced miner signaling and miner power. And so that was, the next iteration that we went through in this open source boardroom. We then had a proposal which said hard forking off is very dangerous. You have to create new code. Everyone has to upgrade their miners, or the exchanges have to make updates. There's a massive amount of updates that need to happen. And then risks were proposed, like relay protection, where essentially if you end up with 2 coins, you could transact on one of the version, the Bitcoin, and then it would transact on the other version, and you needed to protect users from these things. And so a proposal was put out there by Bitcoin Core, whereby you could have a block size increase without increasing the block size. And the proposal was called SegWit. This was called Bitcoin Improvement Proposal number 141. And this way it worked is, rather than forking off and creating a new version of Bitcoin via a hard fork, it was that you can create a new version of the code, and it was a soft fork that was proposed by Bitcoin Core, and it was, here's how we scale without actually having to do a hard fork. And essentially what it did, without getting too geeky, is it moved signature data, which was called the witness data, and it took it outside the block. So if you take all of this signing signature data outside the block, then you in effect have 2 mega blocks without needing a hard fork. That was the proposal, and that's what everybody debated around the time. This basically increased the capacity of blocks by 2x. So it was called 2x. And it fixed a long-standing bug. If you remember, in 2014, the founder of Mt. Gox, Mark Capellas, who bought the exchange from the founder of Ripple, Jeb McCaleb, it was missing those 80,000 Bitcoin, which became a big part of the operation to discredit Bitcoin Foundation and various other things. Mark Capellas blamed the code for what happened to Mt. Gox. And it was because of something called transaction malleability. I don't want to go into it. It's too geeky. But it fixed that issue as well. So a lot of people wanted to fix that issue. There was a scaling solution that was proposed that would double the size of the blocks. And it would enable second layer solutions. What this means, second layer, layer 2, is that rather than going in this infinite game of how much blocks do we need, and then everyone creates a new use case to put everything on the blockchain, and then the blocks get full, and then you think about increasing it, and you keep thinking about increasing it, you end that the solution, the long-term solution, was people can lock up some Bitcoin, and then within that you can create a layer 2, a second layer, where people could transact within what was called a Lightning network, and you can open these channels, and then you can have instant private transactions that cost virtually nothing. But somebody who opened the channel would lock up some Bitcoin, and then only when you close the channel do you get your Bitcoin back. But it created this layer 2 scaling solution that could infinitely scale, was the idea, and it would create privacy within those transactions. So because people wanted this Lightning proposed solution, and they wanted to experiment with increasing the blocks, and they wanted to fix the transaction malleability bug, the compromise, which was reached in a series of public meetings that were filmed. I was at one of them, the one that took place in Hong Kong called Scaling Bitcoin. There was a Hong Kong agreement. There was one in Milan in Italy. There was another one in New York. And different miners would attend, different business people would attend, different users like myself would attend, and different industry people would attend. And they try and come to an agreement, but whatever they signed in that agreement wouldn't be the consensus of the whole community because many people didn't attend. And so you can agree whatever you want, but there is a process of involving the whole community to reach consensus in a network that is very hard to change in order to maintain some of its commodity-like features so that what people invested in doesn't change too much. And that proposal was called SegWit 2x. It was segregated witness, and it had an increase in megabytes 2x. And basically what it would do, it would activate SegWit via a soft fork to prevent the need to split the community and end up with two coins. It would, after doing implementing segregated witness, it agreed that by a certain block, remember there's a new block every 10 minutes, so you have time stamping, by a certain block, Bitcoin Core, or the people that signed the agreement, the companies, the miners, the developers that signed the agreement, would agree to follow up after segregated witness with a 2 megabyte hard fork. And this would be the block size increase. And so the hard fork is the very, very challenging operation. That's where you can end up with two coins. You can have a split in the community. Many things can go wrong. So it was a soft fork followed by a hard fork. But we learned as a result of this, what a soft fork looks like, what a hard fork looks like, what the resistance looks like. And when people try to get together and agree to things that other people that may not have been there agree to, what that actually looks like. And this is what I'm saying. The narrative that none of this happened is just an obfuscation of reality. Now, I was there, and that agreement did happen. It was agreed that we would go to SegWit, soft fork, and then we would go to 2 megabytes via a hard fork. And so in July 2017 rather, I remember I was giving a presentation in Shanghai, if I remember correctly, when it activated in real time, and I gave a presentation from the stage around that we have moved to the next stage because SegWit activation, and it was done via Bitcoin Improvement Proposal number 91. And so this was a 2 megabyte fork via SegWit by taking out the signatures. Again, sorry if I'm getting too geeky here. But moving towards 2x and doing the hard fork was planned for block number 494,784. So about almost up to the 500,000 block. Now, however, it never happened. And I do believe a lot of people were very, very upset because a group of people signed and agreed to do it. And then those core developers didn't do it after SegWit 2x. So I can understand why a lot of people or some people would have been upset. But what happened leading up to that? Adoption on that proposed solution was debated, whether it was low, whether it was high, and community support was basically deeply divided. There was a corporate unification around bigger blocks and getting fees low. And Barry Silbert, with all of his venture capital investment, tried to make that happen. Many of the companies that I invested in tried to make that happen. Many of the miners wanted to make that happen because what would happen if you have layer 2 solutions? Well, those transaction fees in layer 2 meant that the miners wouldn't receive large fees. And so this was debated. It broke certain advantages that a miner called Bitmain, remember how I said I met, Jihan Wu, had called ASIC boost. And basically it gave his mining machines an unfair advantage. Well, you could call it unfair or not. It was technology they developed, and this broke that technology. So one of the companies that was selling all of these miners didn't like it because that was one of their advantage. Many developers opposed it. Many wanted, we went through that process of the boardroom. Some of those may have been infiltrated via operations. Others may not. We can speculate on all those different things. But the economic majority was, basically unclear, because you had signaling from people that had a lot of economic value on the line. There is difference to somebody that has no Bitcoin versus Coinbase. And so there was this concept of, if everyone's signaling, but how much of it is economic? And this was debated back and forth as well. And so days before activation, the fork was cancelled. And this really upset a bunch of people. And so there was a resistance against that decision. And that was, every time a decision is made, there is, a cause and an effect. And so in 2017, Bitmain, remember, Jihan Wu, paid a developer to create Bitcoin ABC. That Bitcoin ABC later became known as the Bitcoin Cash BCH hard fork. And it was developed as Bitcoin ABC. And it was because, Bitmain wanted to probably keep its ASIC boost, or it had an ideological alignment with big blocks, or it didn't want these, these layer 2 scaling. Whatever it was, we can speculate. But however, it was, if we don't get Jihan Wu and a group of people who were very important in the network, and many of the miners in China said, if we don't get our 2 megabyte blocks, then we're going to release a competing implementation. We'll copy all the code and we'll create a new version, and it will be a hard fork. And so this created an environment where miners had to decide what to do, node operators had to decide what to do, and developers had to decide what to do. Some of them split off, like a developer called Jeff Garzik created SegWit 2x. And it was never actually implemented because it had a bug. People tested it. It turned out that it had a bug. And so people said, we're not going to go in that direction. And so this, essentially, the hard fork was later called Bitcoin Cash. And when we did the debate in part 2, Steve Patterson and Roger Ver, who wrote that book, were ideologically aligned with Bitcoin Cash. Some people say that Roger Ver created Bitcoin Cash. That wasn't my memory, but I don't know what happened behind the scenes. I think he joined the project later. I also did if you look up Simon Dixon, Dr. Craig Wright in YouTube, you'll find me at a conference in Hong Kong where Dr. Craig Wright he wouldn't say that Bitcoin Cash was the chain that he wanted to create to be the version of Bitcoin that he believed he created. But I pushed him in a corner and I got him to admit that he thought Bitcoin Cash was the real Bitcoin. And so this is when I started to get suspicious about an op and all the other things that we talked about and that I've covered in other blocks as well. But what ultimately was the decider in terms of this massive open source, decentralized boardroom was that the exchanges came along and they created a futures market. And they said, you can say whatever you want, but why don't you put your money on the line? And they created a futures market saying, put your money on the line, whether you want to receive Bitcoin Cash in the future or Bitcoin in the future. And then we had real economic value based upon people that were speculating to determine and give us more information rather than these, just people signaling that cost nothing. And then we had more and more information. So the first exchange that launched this was Bitfinex, full disclosure. As a result of a hack in 2016, I supported victims of the Bitfinex hack, and everyone was compensated, including myself, through shares in the company. Bank to the Future put together a syndicate of shareholders. But Bitfinex basically became the exchange for all global people that wanted to bet and use futures in order to determine what the value, whether they would support Bitcoin Cash or whether they would support Bitcoin. And so they also had one in China. So the Chinese people could use an exchange, which was via BTC. Also an exchange in the US, another company I was a shareholder in called Kraken. We had at Bank to the Future, we wanted to decentralize private equity. So we had 1,400 investors as part of our syndicate to push back against the venture capitalists. We were involved in the mission of decentralizing private equity. We had shares in Kraken as well, which allowed US to speculate on the futures market so that people could determine these things. All this to say, these markets allow traders to essentially price the probability of Bitcoin Cash being, supported and basically succeeding Bitcoin and becoming the real Bitcoin. So we had signaling, we had all of these different things. The relative value of Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash on those exchanges basically became the likelihood of, hash power shifting. And so miners were deciding, am I going to put my hash power towards Bitcoin Cash or Bitcoin? And this could be fatal for their business. And so now this is not talk. This is not games. This is not poker. This is reality. So the Bitcoin Cash futures traded at approximately 10 to 20% of the value of Bitcoin. So what that was saying is that those with economic value, and obviously you can try and manipulate markets, do what you need to do. There's all these flaws in these pockets of centralization. An exchange is a centralized entity as well. But when real money's on the line, your customers are going to be complaining if you can prove market manipulation. But 10 to 20, and then there's multiple exchanges. But 10 to 20% of Bitcoin's value was essentially what the futures market was saying. So it was set, for block 478, 858, which was August the 1st, 2017, that effectively it increased the block size limit, and we would go on this fork. And so, those that wanted to do that, the futures market were determining, and then the miners had to determine whether they were going to actually put their economic value behind Bitcoin or Bitcoin Cash. And that's the very hard decision that needs to be made with a hard fork versus a soft fork. Anyway, there was a version, Bitcoin Cash. What did it actually do? Well, it increased the block size to 8 megabytes. So it was Gavin Andreessen's original Bitcoin XT implementation. But it also removed SegWit. So you didn't have the witness, taken out of the block. And it also, so you couldn't do Lightning Network layer 2 solutions in that particular implementation. But it preserved all of Bitcoin's history, right back to, the very first block. And so what actually happened in the end is that if you had Bitcoin, you received free Bitcoin Cash. And the hard fork meant that the community split. And there would now be 2 coins. But a debate really developed around this whole thing called relay protection. And we'll go through that as well, just to understand it, because all this stuff is going to come up in the next debate. So you would have, if you had 1 Bitcoin, you would also have received 1 Bitcoin Cash. And it was created as a separate chain. And then it had, the exchanges decided to not call it BTC. So the exchanges had their role. It decided to call it BCH, Bitcoin Cash. Bitfinex called it BCC. The community started trolling on Bitcoin Cash and calling it Bcash. And there was a open source debate around all of these things as well. But what the issue was is that Roger Ver had a website called Bitcoin.com. And within that website, it developed a wallet for Bitcoin.com. And that wallet called Bitcoin, BTC, Bitcoin Cash, and called BCH the real Bitcoin. And so now there was a threat not to have relay protection. What this meant is we entered into a game of chicken, which meant if you spent Bitcoin, it could relay onto the new chain, and then you could lose value based upon, not having that particular protection. Sorry if I butchered the technicals. I'm just trying to keep it simple. But basically, a transaction broadcasted on one chain can be relayed onto another chain. That was the protection that was needed. And if you didn't have this protection, then it was kind of dangerous for exchanges and other economic powers within the network. So what did those economic powers do? Well, they said, we'll make sure that we have a system for until there is relay protection, we'll stop making any withdrawals on the exchanges, and we'll name the coin what we think it is. So everybody had their say based upon the value that they brought to the community in this open set boardroom. And so, this could have lost people's funds at the time. So this scared a lot of people out of Bitcoin in 2017. You'll see that many people just thought this was carnage, thought the project was going to end. It's kind of like what people are saying right now. Everyone was pushing lots of drama. They were saying, if this doesn't happen, I'm out. The whole thing will be killed. That would scare some people into selling. The market price corrected, and we have exactly what we're having right now. And there was a standoff, and the standoff was SegWit via Bitcoin Improvement Proposal number 141, and it required 95% of the miners to basically activate. So you had to get 95% of the miners to activate, that they wanted this SegWit version of the chain. So now you had a game of chicken. You had the hard fork, which said, here's our version, and we won't have relay protection. Then you had a need to cooperate with the miners. So the developers couldn't make the decision on their own. The developer said, here's what we want. Here's the code. Now we need 95% of the miners to activate this. And so they developed within this Bitcoin improvement proposal that way for miners to signal. It doesn't mean you have to put your economic value. It's cheap. You can signal what you actually wanted. And so this stalled for months. Some were signaling and others were just holding out and waiting for the very end. So this signaling became a little bit stupid. But in the end, the miners, by that block time, were going to have to make a decision. Do I put my mining power towards Bitcoin or Bitcoin Cash? And the consequences will be catastrophic for those miners. So some miners basically appeared withdrawing their support. Others were chickening out. Others were signaling support. And this debate escalated over whether miners were essentially trying to force these different types of consensus. So did the miners have two powers? So it went from, the debate was, the developers are enforcing what they want. Then the developers realized they couldn't get what they want. And so it was, the debate moved to, miners are enforcing what they want. Do they have all the power? And so do the miners then decide whether we get the increase in the block size based upon whether they put their power to Bitcoin or Bitcoin Cash? And you can bet all of the different ecosystems were using their influence, venture capitalists, to try and determine what the miners were going to do. And all eyes went over to the miners. And so the developers and the community members then said, hold on, do the miners have too much power here? And so BIP 148 was proposed. And the idea was that miners that won't activate SegWit, it is the users that will do that. How did they do that? Well, they created this concept of a user-activated soft fork. So the users came along and said, I'm running my nodes. And when I'm running my nodes, if the miners say that you're going to mine the one that has the big block, well, I'm not going to allow my node to support your block. I'm not going to approve it for inclusion. So it was called a user-activated soft fork because any user that wanted to run a node could run a node because it's trivial and inexpensive to do it. You need some technical skills, but this is the important. And so a user-activated soft fork is not activated by miners. It's activated by anyone that wants to run a node. So if you then custody all of your Bitcoin with Coinbase, then essentially it's not proof of stake, but you don't have a node. You don't get a vote in that type of network. But just by custodying it with Coinbase, it just meant that you're not somebody that's in self-custody with a node. So you don't hand over your power to Coinbase like proof of stake, like shares when you invest in an ETF. You just forfeit your game, your ability to play in the game. But those that run the nodes, the users that run the nodes, they actually can push against the miners. And that's this set up. So instead of waiting for miner majority at 95%, nodes would basically begin rejecting blocks that didn't signal SegWit. And so you could take all the miners that didn't signal for SegWit and say, we're going to reject your blocks in a game of chicken. And then that pushed back to the miners. And then the miners were saying, oh man, am I going to put all my hash power over to Bitcoin or Bitcoin Cash? And it was catastrophic for those companies. Now, if those companies had shareholders, then they had fiduciary duty to those shareholders. It created this concept of economic nodes, i.e. nodes that have lots of value, exchanges, businesses, and users that may have had a tiny amount of value, but maybe they verified lots of transactions. And so people were looking at, anyone can fire up a node and one person can have 20 nodes. But what if there's only one in those 20 that was actually verifying transactions and syncing? And so this became a concept of how do you know which nodes are the real nodes? And so all this to say is that this is the most decentralized project that some people want to say it was just one developer that can make this decision. It's consensus across these different mechanisms of power. And so, those that were basically it shifted the power narrative from miners control everything. So it started as developers control everything. Then it moved to miners control everything. And then it was that users control everything via BIP 148. And it was basically set to activate on that date, August the 1st, 2017. And so what was going to happen from that date, as that block was approaching and everyone was getting more nervous and we were debating on YouTube and everyone, everything was getting more and more closer to here's the deadline, here's what's going to happen. Everyone decide what you're going to do. But effectively, nodes that were running Bitcoin Improvement Proposal, BIP 148, would reject non-SegWit, ignoring blocks. This was developed by a core developer, Luke Jr. I don't know how say that. Somebody that's involved in the current NOTS implementation. Miners were essentially, adopting Bitcoin 91. And this had a coordination mechanism for people to signal, but the signal didn't determine whether you were actually going to do it. And so it just became a signaling mechanism that people could use in determining what to do next. BIP 91 basically lowered the signaling threshold. And so rather than having to wait for 95% of the miners, this version said we can lower the threshold of signal before we actually get the implementation, and this becomes the code, and we soft fork over, and it was that effectively locked in SegWit. It was when you had mining power, signaling, consensus, user-activated soft fork, code that was developed, competing implementations, this kind of triggered going from chaos to getting to exactly where we were meant to be, which was the SegWit activation, and that was without any kind of disruptive split. And so everybody could have decided, okay, that was the battle, or you could have decided, I'm going to be involved in a separate project, and that separate project needed relay protection. Before many basically assumed that miners were ultimately deciding, people claimed that it was developers, but it turned out the nodes had an important role to play in that. And then, full nodes were basically people that could enforce. And that brings us to the consensus process that we have today. Now, find any other project that has forked off or created competing implementations that has that amount of economic value, security, and different players that are able to engage in the game theory as it as it turned out. And so now we know from that experience that miners have to follow economic consensus. They have their power, but there is also competing when that power goes wrong. And so basically, Bitcoin Cash, they consciously decided to separate rather than attempt to overwrite. They did the relay protection in order to protect consumers from losing their money. And they decided they made a branding attempt. I remember there was manipulation on exchanges. There were people that using spam bots to get the fees up like crazy within Bitcoin. There were multiple attempts for people to use covert, warfare mechanisms as well. But after SegWit was activated, basically, we had massive tension, massive competition, and there were two coins, and basically the market determined what was Bitcoin and whether Bitcoin Cash was the real Bitcoin. Bitcoin significantly outperformed Bitcoin Cash in terms of price over time, and Bitcoin Cash became its own project. Now, after that, the tensions cooled off. There was always this, these different types of community splits and people getting really, really angry. But that implementation of the user activated soft fork basically remained the minority client, so that if you are running a node, you could run that minority client that very few people were running, or you could use Core's version of the software when you're running a node. And so there was no real need to go to that minority implementation and run it on your nodes. Pretty much everybody was running Core's version. Now, later, everything calmed down. We had all the different operations, all the different things that happened. Bitcoin became really Main Street. We had the entrance of Wall Street. We had ETFs. We had the Biden administration, Operation Choke Point 2.0. We had the Trump administration, crypto capital, all the psyops, everything that we're experiencing right now. We had, this whole, we're going to write regulation for stable coins, which was, I believe, the gateway drug project. But basically the debate shifted towards a new project that people wanted to implement. I think it was 2023, if memory serves me right, called Taproot. And Taproot was effectively a new group of developers within Core. So many of the old developers are replaced with new developers. You have 6 to 7, 6 people that can implement, they can use their key in order to implement code. And that rotates, and people leave, they go to different companies, they start working on their own projects. This is the decentralized project that we have. But this new group of developers seem to want to support Taproot. And Taproot had a lot of support from the Core community. And some wanted it because they could do more things with Bitcoin. You could have tokens, you could have different things. I don't want to go into the debate anyway. But Taproot was something that not that many people were really, after the block war debate, many of the key people kind of tapped out, as it were, in Taproot, pardon the pun. But those that were left around started debating around Taproot. And it was decided that this mechanism that optimizes different types of use cases, but some people interpreted that as this is kind of an upgrade that allows for NFTs and Bitcoin virtual machines, and it sounded very much like Ethereum. And so many people were excited. Some people were excited about creating NFTs on top of Bitcoin rather than creating non-fungible tokens on top of Ethereum or Solana or anything. So this kind of restarted the debate, and it entered into this. Okay, now loads of people, when Taproot was implemented, started paying significant fees, and fees went through the roof during the activation block and around the activation block. And big miners were essentially putting like pictures of Donald Trump in the blockchain. A company called Marathon, a large public miner that was trying to get political influence and contribute to the lobby as well. And so we had, lots of people that were trying to create coins and various other things and stable coins on top of Bitcoin. But a core community, rather than the word core, mainly that went around knots, were saying that we believe Bitcoin should just be optimized for money and everything else is spam. And so the spam debate really emerged again. And it came back. And this was all around a set of, a bunch of developers created something called ordinals, where you could create these things called inscriptions in 2023, and you could create and launch non-fungible tokens, NFTs, on top of Bitcoin. But these basically it required a lot of data to be inscripted, and it would fill the blocks. And so then the fees would get a lot higher. And as was always predicted, when you add new use cases and you increase the block, people find new things to put in the blocks, and therefore you start filling the blocks, and then it becomes more expensive to transact as money. And so this whole debate reemerged again, the same debate we've always had. And some basically saw this as spam. Others saw this as anyone that's willing to pay the fees should be able to include whatever they want in the Bitcoin blockchain. Others were like, well, we're just focusing on money. This is a more important thing. Others were like, no, we have to compete with Ethereum. And there was, I think, a ideological shift within Core that listened to the users that wanted to have inscriptions and ordinals, and would try and optimize a solution to please those that wanted to have all this different types of data. So, some saw it as legitimate fee market demand. And so basically what Knots did, implemented basically a stricter methodology and policy using the mempool. I don't want to go too deep into these things, in order to have a default setting where it would be more difficult for nodes to, improve and approve blocks that contained these inscriptions when you're running your node. And it was basically a more aggressive filtering mechanism with the design of specifically discouraging people from putting all of these different types of files on the Bitcoin blockchain, and what it considered spam, discouraging spam. While the core developers decided that they would follow a slightly different approach. They would essentially create a trash can called an op return, where you could put the trash in the op return rather than having it within the block as well. So this lays the foundation for you to try and understand the background, that while anyone is telling you a developer can change everything, or the miners ultimately get to decide, or the users ultimately get to decide, that their categoric belief that if this doesn't happen, then everything's going to rain and fall. I'm going to give you both sides of that argument, and I'm going to do this through a summary. I asked artificial intelligence to create a summary of some of the long 2-hour, 4-hour videos that were put together, or some of the shorter videos from some of the key people. I've just picked a few people, 3 people. And then I'm going to go through these AI summaries, tell you what the implication is. It's going to be done on a nice whiteboard so that you can understand some more of the technical details. And I'm going to end this by telling you exactly what I will be doing and whether I believe this is an operation to hijack Bitcoin from both sides, and what that means for the future of Bitcoin. And then we're going to end it there. And I hope this was enjoyable for you. So what we're going to do right now is I'm going to play a whiteboard video, the first artificial intelligence summary, from somebody that is very vocal on the Bitcoin not side and BIP 110. And that is a Bitcoin University, which is a YouTube channel by a guy called Matthew Kratter. And so, Azad, if you could play the first AI summary. Yeah, if we could play the first AI summary, and then I'll come back after that.
You know, there's a battle for the very soul of Bitcoin happening right now. And it all boils down to one question. Who gets to decide what's allowed on the network? So today, we're going to break down a video from the channel Bitcoin University that jumped right into this fight. It's from February 12, 2026, and it's all about a controversial proposal called BIP 110.
So at the very heart of this whole conflict is this question right here. Is the Bitcoin blockchain being clogged up with junk? And we're not just talking about messy data. We're talking about images, tokens, all sorts of non-financial files taking up precious block space. Space that a lot of people think should be for one thing and one thing only: money.
Okay, so what's the proposed fix? It's a soft fork known as BIP 110. The easiest way to think about it is like a new rule for the network, one designed to filter out all this non-monetary data. And as you can probably guess, trying to change the rules of Bitcoin has sparked a massive fight.
And this isn't just some technical disagreement between developers, It's really a philosophical battle over Bitcoin's fundamental identity. What is this thing actually for?
The whole debate really boils down to two opposing camps. On one side, you have people who argue that Bitcoin is and should only ever be a network for permissionless money. But on the other side, you have people who see it as a permissionless network for any kind of data. And these two visions, they are fundamentally at odds with each other.
The argument from Bitcoin University couldn't be clearer. They put it just like this. Bitcoin is permissionless money. It's not permissionless cloud data storage. The pro-BIP 110 camp believes the network was built for one specific job: to be the best money the world has ever seen, not some kind of decentralized Dropbox. All right, so that's the argument for the change. But what about the other side? What are the main criticisms against doing this? The source video actually spends most of its time tackling these objections head-on, so let's break them down one by one. So the first big pushback you hear is basically, who cares? The argument goes something like this. A node runner has to store blocks of data anyway, so what does it matter what's in that data? Whether it's a financial transaction or a picture of a cat, it all takes up space, right? But here's the thing, the rebuttal is that it's not just about disk space. This so-called spam creates a huge technical burden. It chews up bandwidth when you're trying to download the blockchain. It burns CPU power for verification, and it dramatically slows down the whole process for anyone trying to set up a new node. It's a massive drain on the entire system. But here's where it really hits home for the average user, right in the wallet. See, all this extra data is competing for space with actual monetary transactions. And when demand for that limited block space goes way up, what happens? The fees, they go through the roof. And look, we're not just talking hypotheticals here. The source points to what they called a spam attack back in 2023. The fee to get just a single transaction into the next block spiked to over $157. I mean, that makes using Bitcoin as actual money incredibly expensive for pretty much everyone. Okay, on to the next major criticism. This one is the why even bother argument. It basically says, look, this is a waste of time. Even if you block one method of storing data, the spammers are just going to find another way around it. The source counters this with a pretty brilliant analogy. They say this is like arguing we shouldn't have email spam filters. I mean, of course, spammers adapt and find new ways, but we still fight it, right? We build filters, we make new policies, because the alternative, just letting it run wild, is so much worse. Taking a stand actually matters. The video really frames this don't even try attitude as just defeatist. As they say in the video, imagine telling someone that they shouldn't try to stop email spam because spammers might come up with new ways to spam. The goal isn't to be perfect, it's to make it crystal clear that this is an abuse of the network and to actually fight back. And that brings us to the final and honestly, maybe the most important point of this whole debate. It's rooted in a huge misunderstanding about how Bitcoin is actually governed. Who gets to decide if a new rule like BIP 110 gets adopted? So let's get this straight, because it is super important. In Bitcoin, you have miners and you have node runners. They are not the same thing. Think of miners as employees of the network. They get paid to bundle transactions into blocks. But the node runners, the thousands of volunteers all over the world running the software, they are the ones who actually enforce the rules of the network. They're the guardians. And this, right here, is the ultimate power dynamic. Opponents of BIP 110 might say, well, the miners will never accept this. But as the source video explains, this is Bitcoin 101. Miners follow the rules that the nodes enforce. If a miner creates a block that thousands of nodes all over the world consider invalid, that block gets rejected. And guess what? The miner doesn't get paid. It's really as simple as that.
So when you pull back and look at the big picture, it's clear this debate over one soft fork isn't just about code. It's really a proxy war for the future of the entire network. Is Bitcoin a highly specialized tool for sound money, or is it a generic anything-goes data platform?
And that leaves all of us with a really critical question to think about. This isn't just about technology. It's about governance and vision. As Bitcoin continues to grow and evolve, who truly gets to decide what it is and what it will become? The developers, the miners, or the individual users running the code? That right there is the real debate.
Okay, so I wanted to give you one extreme. So Luke Dash Jr. is the Bitcoin core developer that's kind of moving over to this, NOTs implementation and supporting BIP 110. And that was a summary of a video from Bitcoin University Matthew Kratter. Now I want to go to the other extreme side. And so the core implementation, so they're saying that they're still trying to optimize, for removal of spam, but they have a different way of doing it. And some will frame it as they are trying to encourage spam. And some people are questioning the developers and the core developers around that in this open source boardroom. But what they did is they effectively kept the default policy more neutral. So with Bitcoin Nots, when you download, you run Bitcoin Nots on your node, the default policy is optimized for not mining, not approving any of those blocks that contain what they believe is spam, and you can set those settings, and that's the default. With the Bitcoin Core implementation, it's a bit more neutral. Effectively, there was a op return that was previously 84 megabytes, is now 100,000 kilobytes. Sorry, I think it's megabytes. 100,000 megabytes, 100 kilobytes. So it's a significant increase, but the default settings, they claim, are a bit more neutral, and many people might just stick to the default settings rather than tinkering. And basically, they make the distinction between that policy it does not equal consensus. And this is the whole consensus is the argument around the forks, the hard fork, but policy is the argument around the soft fork. And obviously, a hard fork is a lot more, it involves a lot more changes from the entire ecosystem if we end up doing that. And it emphasizes fee market neutrality. So what it means is if you want to put spam in the blockchain, and you're willing to pay for it, then fine, we'll put it in this trash can, but you can pay for it. And it means those that want to use Bitcoin as money, they have to compete with you. And so this is how it is, and this is what people are doing. And it turned out that Taproot just enabled all of this trash. And if many of them could go back, maybe they would reverse that. But somebody that is effectively a supporter of the core implementation, the core V30, was a guy that we were very active with in the user activated soft fork side when we were putting together a resistance against miners, a developer that wasn't a core developer, but was part of the community. And he was on the Tone Vase shows throughout all of this this Blocksize War debate and the user activated soft fork. And his name is Vortex. And he recently appeared on Tone Vase YouTube channel. And I created an AI summary. This is going to be the second one that really pushes towards why the world is falling if you don't excuse me, why the world is falling if you don't implement Core V30, whereas the other one is the world is falling if you don't do BIP 110. So Azad, if you could play the second AI summary.
Welcome to The Explainer. All right, let's jump right in. We're talking about a proposal in the Bitcoin world that's causing a huge stir. It's called BIP 110. And believe me, some are calling this a full-on battle for the soul of Bitcoin. And to kick things off, let's look at this quote from a developer named Vortex, who's right in the middle of this whole thing. He's basically saying, hey everyone, calm down, the sky is not falling. So right away you can feel the tension, right? So what is BIP 1110 really? Well, it's a proposal to change Bitcoin's core rules, and it's a big deal. Now, this whole explainer is based on a nearly 2-hour deep dive from the Tone Vase channel that dropped on February 12th, 2026. We've boiled it all down for you, focusing on the arguments against this change, so you can really get a handle on what's at stake. All right, so what's the big deal? What's all the fuss about? It really boils down to this one problem. What do we do with all this non-financial data, some people just call it spam, that's getting stored forever on the Bitcoin blockchain? Okay, so there are basically two ways this data gets on the chain. On one side, you've got the official way, using something called OP return. Think of it like a designated trash can. You put data there, and nodes can eventually prune it or throw it away. No big deal. But then you've got this other method. People found a workaround, a way to embed data inside what look like real financial transactions. The problem? That stuff can't be thrown away. It becomes a permanent burden, clogging up the network and making it more expensive for everyone to run a node. So to deal with this, the Bitcoin core developers did something pretty smart. They basically made that official trash can, the OPR return, way bigger. They removed the size limit. Now, you might be asking, why would they do that? Why encourage this stuff? Well, it was a harm reduction strategy. See, miners were already starting to create these private, centralized back channels to cram this data into blocks anyway. So Core's move was about keeping the whole process out in the open, keeping the market for block space public and decentralized, instead of letting it slip into the shadows. And this is where the battle lines really get drawn. A rival proposal, BIP 110, comes onto the scene. It's being pushed by an alternative Bitcoin client called Knots, and they have a radically different idea of how to solve this. So what's their big plan? They want to use something called a user-activated soft fork, or a UASF. Now, this is a really big gun in the Bitcoin world. It's a super controversial method that lets users and exchanges, not miners, force a change to the most fundamental rules of the network. And their goal is simple, to start filtering this so-called spam right at the consensus level. But to really get why this is so risky, we need to take a quick trip back in time. See, this isn't the first time we've seen a USF. There was a huge one back in 2017, and what happened then is absolutely critical to understanding the fight we're seeing today. And this chart, wow, it just lays it all out perfectly. The difference is night and day. Back in 2017, the UASF was all about enforcing an upgrade that the core developers had already written. The community was basically saying, hey miners, let's get this done. But today, BIP 110 is trying to do the exact opposite, is trying to override and roll back a decision that Core deliberately made. The entire dynamic is flipped on its head. So what's the big lesson from 2017? It's this. You can't just code your way around economic consensus. If the actual economy, the users, the businesses, the exchanges that actually use Bitcoin doesn't support a change, you can't force it on them. It's that simple. Technical proposals don't get to override economic reality. Okay, so with that history lesson in mind, let's talk about the potential fallout. What are the actual dangers of BIP 110? Because the arguments here, they aren't just about philosophy. They're about real, tangible things that could break. So yeah, what could actually go wrong? We're not talking about hypotheticals here. The core argument against BIP 110 is that it threatens to break technology that's already working, stop future innovation in its tracks, and maybe worst of all, actually split the entire Bitcoin network. First up, let's look at the tech at risk. We're talking about breaking things like Miniscript, which is crucial for secure wallets and complex contracts. It could completely kill promising upgrades for scaling the Lightning Network, like LNS symmetry. It could hinder stuff like BitVM, which is all about building trustless bridges. Basically, the fear is that it just slams the door shut on years and years of important development. But honestly, the technical stuff is just the beginning. The risks to the network itself are even bigger. For one, this proposed 55% activation threshold, critics say that's not a path to unity. It's a recipe for a guaranteed messy chain split. And even more fundamentally, it just shatters Bitcoin's neutrality. It would create a dangerous precedent where a small group gets to decide which transactions are acceptable and which aren't. And once you open that door, you're on a slippery slope to censorship and centralized control. Which brings us back to that first quote, right? The core argument here is that this whole thing is a manufactured fake emergency. The problem of so-called spam, it's argued, is something to be dealt with at the wallet or node level, a policy issue, not something that needs a sledgehammer to fix at the consensus level. It's seen as using a non-existent crisis to push through a really radical and dangerous change. So after all that, what's the final verdict? What's the big takeaway for the future of Bitcoin? At the end of the day, what's really on the line is the core philosophy of Bitcoin itself. Its superpower, its greatest strength, is that it's a neutral, permissionless system. It validates transactions based on cold, hard rules, not on what's in them. The moment you introduce a content filter at the most basic level, you kind of break that fundamental promise. So what's going to happen? Well, the prediction coming out of this discussion is that this won't be decided by a Twitter mob or loud arguments. It's going to be decided by the market, by the economic consensus. Think about it. The big exchanges, the businesses, the institutions building on Bitcoin, they need stability. They have absolutely zero appetite for this kind of high-stakes drama. The bet is that they'll just reject this change and stick with what works. And that really leaves us with the ultimate question, doesn't it? This whole fight boils down to this. Who decides what Bitcoin is? Is it the entire sprawling global economy of everyone who uses it? Or is it a small group that thinks they have a better set of rules? The answer to that question is going to define Bitcoin for a very, very long time.
All right, so I think you can see the key philosophical divide has kind of resurfaced again around this kind of, let's call it the 2023 to 2026 spam debate. So I just want to do two more things. Firstly, I don't agree with both of the extreme positions. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you what happens next, because I think the uncertainty is what's putting some people off. And so I'm going to tell you what I think, is coming next. And then I'm going to give a more nuanced interpretation from somebody that I agree with, which is Jimmy Song. And that is his perspective, and an AI summary that I'm going to give of his perspective is more aligned with what I think is the reality here. And so then I'm going to do one more thing, which is exactly what I'm going to do next, so that then hopefully you can go on your journey and decide whether this is something to not worry about because you've got other things to do, engage with because you're now understanding that this is a philosophical thing, or you want to actually, make the same move as I want to make. And I'm not trying to encourage any of that. I'm just want to share with what I'm doing, and whether we can answer the final question: is this a Bitcoin hijack, or is this actually the proof that Bitcoin is resistant against hijacking? And so really, let's look at what stage we're in right now. So we are in what's called the signaling stage. And basically, the current software, NOTS plus BIP 110, which is the proposed soft fork, is in the signaling phase. And so you NOTS, so if you have a node, you can run NOTS and you can decide to set the settings to filter out the spam and not support what may be non-monetary non-monetary transactions. But even if you're running the NOTS implementation, which gives competition to the core implementation, you can choose between the two, and you don't need to be forced into one or the other. And even if you're running NOTS, you don't need to signal that you want to support Bitcoin Improvement Proposal 110, which is the actual soft fork. So you have what you're running on your node and whether you want the network to soft fork. You could do both. You could say, I'm going to run my filtering NOTS node. I'm going to set the parameters, or I'm going to use the defaults, which filter a lot of the spam. But I'm going to decide whether I want a signal to support BIP 110. So let me make sure you understand the time frame as far as I understand it. There are two things that are happening now. The first is miners need to signal. This is what's called a miner activated soft fork. And if the miners basically get 55%, So effectively, you can signal, which we know isn't whether you actually do it or not. But the activation mechanism kicks in at 55% of miners who signal support. And if they don't get to 55%, then there is another set of actions that happens here. Now, if the miners don't decide to activate, and remember, the miners are completely different to 2017. You have the Chinese miners, you have the Iranian miners, you have the Kingdom of Bhutan miners, you have home miners, you have the public companies, you have the private companies. This is a serious infrastructure since we last had this type of debate. The other way that this could actually happen is if there's a user-activated soft fork, so a UASF. So if the miners don't activate, then the users could decide that they want to push a campaign for an activation. And so basically, the UASF is scheduled for approximately September the 1st. So if the miners haven't signaled for it, then by September the 1st, or it could be pulled before September the 1st, the nodes can begin basically enforcing the rules based upon how much economic activity that they have there. And there you can see that there are a few iterations of what might actually happen here. And just like the last time, this could just be dead in the water and not get to the right number. Or it could be something that actually becomes important, and therefore the economic actors have to all do it. Now, if a user-activated soft fork happens, there's a proposal that the other side at core or other node operators that support core may decide to do a user-rejected soft fork, a URSF, which is something we've never seen before. This is an option after if, a miner activated soft fork doesn't happen, a user activated soft fork does happen, and then there could be a user rejected soft fork. All this to say is that there are check and controls at every part of the process, and you can either decide to tap out, and I'll cover this on Simon Dixon Hard Talk. You can decide to be involved and you can follow others, or you maybe are an economic actor and you're deciding what to do. But BIP 110, just to alleviate concerns, has a reversal mechanism built in. So it's pretty, after a year, it's done in a responsible way. So, I believe that this is being implemented in whether people agree with this or not. Having a reversal mechanism means if this goes completely wrong, it can be reversed. And so that might be something that happens as well. So you can see there's a lot of game theory that could happen here. Now, what I want to do is I want to answer the question as my final part, and I'm going to do one more AI summary. Is the sky falling? Is this as bad as both sides on the extreme are making out? And to put my answer is no. And I think the opinion that I agree with, that I am most aligned with, before I summarize and end for this episode, is an opinion that Jimmy Song put forward when he was debating Tone Vays. Tone Vays is on the more extreme vortex side, core side of V30. And Jimmy Song has more how I see things based upon my experience of having gone through this many times and been through all the different transitions. And so, Azad, if you could play the final AI summary, then I'm going to come back and I'm going to tell you exactly what I'm doing. And then we'll wrap up for this episode of Simon Dixon Hard Talk Live.
That could quite literally change. There is a civil war brewing in the heart of Bitcoin. Two of its most well-known veterans, Tone Vays and Jimmy Song, just locked horns for nearly 4 hours to debate its future. We watched the whole thing so you wouldn't have to. And this is the essential breakdown of a conflict that could, quite literally, change everything for Bitcoin.
And when I say marathon, I am not kidding. This entire discussion, which was uploaded back on February 10th, 2026, clocks in at just under 4 hours. It is an incredibly dense, technical, and honestly passionate argument about the fundamental direction of the network. So, what on earth is so important that it takes two experts 4 hours to hash it out? Well, it all comes down to a single, really controversial proposed change to Bitcoin's code. That change is called BIP 110. Now, it's a proposal to force a change in Bitcoin's rules using something called a user-activated soft fork, or a UASF. This whole thing is being pushed by an alternative Bitcoin client. Think of it like a different web browser for Bitcoin, called Knots. And it's going directly against the grain of the main dominant client, Bitcoin Core. Okay, so to really understand this battle, we've got to look at it from all sides. We're going to start with the main disagreement, then we'll break down the 3 pillars of Bitcoin it supposedly threatens: the code, the miners, and the nodes. We'll even take a look back at a previous civil war to see what's really at stake before we get to the ultimate question: who actually gets to decide Bitcoin's future? All right, let's dive right into part 1, the heart of the argument. To get where Tone Vays is coming from, you have to understand his core framework for this, which he calls the centralization triangle. And this one sentence right here, this is his entire thesis in a nutshell. Tone is basically arguing that this one proposal, BIP 110, isn't just a small change. He sees it as a direct attack on all 3 of Bitcoin's most critical components: the developers who write the code, the miners who secure the network, and the nodes who validate all the rules. So let's break those down one by one. First up, the code. But really, this is about the people, the developers who spend their lives building and maintaining Bitcoin. The big question here is, will a contentious change like this cause a catastrophic brain drain from the project? From Tone's perspective, this is nothing short of a hostile takeover. He's arguing that if BIP 110 were to succeed, it would essentially be like firing the current trusted Bitcoin core developers by making their recent work obsolete. He's really worried this will cause a mass rage quit, leaving a new, less proven team in charge of Bitcoin's code. But Jimmy pushes back hard on this, framing it not as a coup, but as simple competition. And Jimmy's point really boils down to this simple, relatable idea. You wouldn't quit your job at, say, Coke, just because Pepsi came out with a new flavor. He argues that professional developers don't just pack up their bags and leave. They see it as a challenge to compete, to innovate, to build a better product. To him, it's just business. It's not personal. Now, this gets us to a really key technical point. Jimmy argues that developers' work isn't really being undone or reverted. You see, what Core changed was something called a policy rule. Think of it as a local setting or a filter on your own node. BIP 110, on the other hand, wants to introduce a consensus rule. That's more like a network-wide law that everyone has to follow. They're 2 totally different things. So in his view, it's not about erasing past work. It's about adding a new, stricter rule for the whole network. Okay, let's move on to the second pillar in this conflict, the miners. We're talking about the massive computing operations that secure the network. So how does BIP 110 affect them? So the story starts with a problem. Big, powerful miners could make private deals to include large data transactions and blocks, giving them an unfair advantage over smaller miners. Bitcoin Core's solution was basically to open the floodgates. They got rid of the local filter so that all miners could see and compete for these transactions. BIP 110's approach is the complete opposite. It wants to shut the door for everyone with a network-wide rule, which in its own way also makes sure no single miner gets a special advantage. And here's the thing. Ultimately, both sides claim that their solution is the one that really helps decentralize mining. They both want a level playing field. The fight isn't actually about the what. It's all about the how. Do you want an open, competitive market or a hard-coded limit for everyone? And that brings us to the third and final pillar, the nodes. We're talking about the thousands of people and businesses all over the world who run the Bitcoin software, the ones who validate every single transaction and enforce the rules of the network. This part of the debate gets pretty philosophical. Tone argues that the real motivation behind BIP 110 is fear, specifically the fear of legal trouble if illicit or illegal data gets permanently stored on the Bitcoin blockchain. He believes this is creating a culture of self-censorship that ultimately weakens the network's resilience. But the pro-BIP 110 side sees it as simple common sense, as legal prudence. They argue that for Bitcoin to grow up and succeed globally, it can't afford to be seen as a haven for illegal data. For them, a proactive change like this is just necessary for long-term survival. You know, this entire conflict, it feels a lot like we're watching history repeat itself. And to really understand what's at stake here, we have to go back to Bitcoin's biggest civil war, the Blocksize War of 2017. So back in 2017, the network was completely gridlocked. A really important upgrade called SegWit was being blocked. So in response, a grassroots movement launched a user-activated soft fork, the exact same mechanism being proposed today, and it set a hard deadline. This basically forced everyone's hand. SegWit was activated, and the people who disagreed with it broke off to create their own coin, Bitcoin Cash. But what's really fascinating is how they both look back on that history. Tone sees 2017 as a pretty clear-cut case of the majority using a UASF to get around one single bad actor. He argues that today is the complete opposite. A small minority is trying to hijack the network. Jimmy, though, he remembers a much messier conflict with two legitimate sides, and he thinks the whole analogy is just a distraction. For him, the only thing that matters is whether BIP 110 is a good idea right here, right now. And all of this, it builds up to the final, and frankly, the most important question. This isn't just about data limits or developer drama. This is about how a leaderless, decentralized system actually governs itself when there's no CEO to make the final call. So here's the final breakdown of where they stand. Tone sees this whole thing as a dangerous attack that puts Bitcoin's entire value proposition at risk. For him, the period of uncertainty this creates is the biggest danger. Jimmy, on the other hand, he sees this as a necessary, even healthy test of the system. He believes that actually resolving the uncertainty, no matter which way it goes, is what's essential for Bitcoin's long-term health. And this entire test, this whole civil war, it really comes down to a single number, 55%. For this proposal to succeed, it needs over half of the network's enormous mining power to signal their support before a deadline. That is an incredibly high bar to clear. And this quote from Jimmy really just captures his entire philosophy here. He believes that in a system that's truly decentralized, anyone has to be able to propose a change. And the debate, even the fighting that follows, that's a feature, not a bug. It's how the network actually discovers its own rules. Which leaves us with the ultimate question here. Is a knockdown, drag-out fight like this a sign of weakness, a crack in Bitcoin's foundation? Or is this chaos the entire point? Is this messy, public, contentious conflict not a bug, but the only possible feature that allows a truly leaderless system to actually evolve? The answer won't just decide the fate of BIP 110, it's going to help define what Bitcoin truly is.
Okay, so that's the final AI summary. And of all the opinions and all the perspectives that I've seen, I'm most aligned with Jimmy Song in terms of what I'll be doing. And so I'm just going to outline it so that everybody knows my current position and they can make their decision based upon what they're thinking. So the first thing is both sides are making this way more extreme than it actually is. I think this is a debate that is very important to have. And I think that the process, as Jimmy Song agrees and said, is important to have right now because we are going to be much stronger at the end of this. And this is the anti-fragile nature. So all those people, excuse me, that are making the claim that a developer can change anything, Jeffrey Epstein is the founder of Bitcoin, is completely misguided. And my goal within this whole thing is to help you understand that this is the nature of the only project in the world that is able to withstand all of these attack vectors and not be hijacked at the end of it, despite the fact that everybody wants to hijack it. And so what will I be doing right now? I will be running knots I will continue to run and support knots. And the reason for that is because I do believe that Core V30 went slightly off track and that Core needs to be held accountable with completing implementations. And I think that is good for decentralization. And I think bringing this debate right now determines and helps make the case the Core don't run the shop. And so there is a mechanism for what you do when some people, and I'm not saying this is what I believe, when some people believe that Core has been compromised. And I do believe that there have been attempts to compromise layers of Core and that we should bring all this to the surface so that we can ensure that Bitcoin is stronger. And in terms of BIP 110, I will continue to watch and see what happens. I haven't decided whether I would, engage in any parts of the ecosystem that I'm invested in signaling whether it should be Core V30 or BIP 110. I'm just going to sit out and wait to see where that goes and what the different players decide to do and where this all goes. I'm going to sit next. There is whether the miner activated soft fork happens. And I know that if it happens, then I personally believe that the developers will work on the project and we won't end up in this centralized, kind of fear mongering where only a couple of people are there. People will adjust based upon the reality, or maybe it's not even to be taken seriously. I'm going to keep engaging in that and give updates on that. I will also watch whether we get that user activated soft fork. We know that by September, we will have a lot more information and we'll see what actually happens. Soft fork basically is, the next stage in our journey. We need to know what happens when you have something like this. When influential minorities decide that they want to start a soft fork. And this is good for us to watch, and this is good for us to learn from, and this is good for us to test the nature of Bitcoin. Because this could be somebody else that wants to do this in the future, an institutional player, a sovereign player. We need to get our strength for the next attack vectors and the next attempts to hijack Bitcoin, because everybody at all times is trying to hijack Bitcoin. And as our market capitalization goes up and up and up, the players that are trying to hijack Bitcoin and learn that Bitcoin is not being hijacked increases the value of Bitcoin as this decentralized form of money where I can own my own money, I can spend my own money, and I know that there will only ever be 21 million Bitcoin. And so I think it's really important to determine what happens. They're calling it an intolerant minority that wants to do a soft fork, i.e. there are a minority that are intolerant to the direction that it's going and want to implement a soft fork, because in the future, anyone will be able to do that. So this is the perfect time to do it and for us to learn. And we are, we have pushed everybody who should be paying attention and that wants to be involved in Bitcoin. We pushed everyone to look at that. Sorry, my voice is going. So what is going to be the reaction to this miner activated soft fork, user activated soft fork, and where we have a rejection, a user rejected soft fork? We need to know what will be the role of, now we have Bitcoin ETFs. We didn't have Bitcoin ETFs before. Now we know it's not proof of stake. So proof of stake means just by owning Bitcoin in custody via an ETF, you don't get all the votes. Now that is the case in a proof of stake network. Thankfully, Bitcoin doesn't have that. But what are the Bitcoin treasury companies going to do? What is the most important one, MicroStrategy, going to do? We need to learn what happens when a treasury company that has 650,000 Bitcoin and counting, it doesn't mean just by having that Bitcoin that it gets to vote. It means that it is a large voice in the corporate treasury, Wall Street wrapper, that has a lot of debt as a result of selling convertible notes and debt structures to Wall Street, corporate Wall Street investors, equity investors. Let's see what happens, how Michael Saylor and Strategy react to this. What about the different mining pools? We know that we have a dominant mining pool in America called Foundry that is connected to Digital Currency Group. And Barry Silbert may be one of those layers of compromise that we need to understand more about. What about the Chinese miners like Antpool? What about Luke Dash Jr., who also has his own VC company, Ocean Pool, that is allowing people to create their own templates whenever the miners are putting their mining hash power to a mining pool? What will Ocean Pool do? Is this a compromised network to centralize or decentralize. I'm going to be watching all of these parts cleverly, very, carefully rather. And many other people will be doing the same as well. And they will be creating drama. But we're going to remain cool, calm, collected, knowing that this is the process that I have seen time and time again. And this is the latest flavor of it. What are the US public miners like Marathon going to do? The ones that are connected to crypto lobby, the ones that rely upon finance from Wall Street to run their mining operation, the ones that create services like Slipstream in order to filter out the transactions that they don't want included. Do we allow it to happen at the miner level or the node level? I'm going to keep watching that, and I'll be reporting everything that I learn. What about the private miners like Tether, the most important private miner that we know is deeply integrated as a stablecoin into Clarity Act, Genius Act, is custodying some of their treasuries with Cantor Fitzgerald. Cantor Fitzgerald, Howard Lutnick connected to Jeffrey Epstein operations. We need to understand the reactions that happen from all of these different types of things. And we've got Bitcoin treasury companies. But despite the fact that all these different hijack operations exist, what will the home miners do? What about those that are, in Africa that are running small mining operations that allowed them to repurpose energy? What will non-US sovereign miners do, like Kazakhstan, like Iran, like UAE, like the Kingdom of Bhutan? We're going to watch and we're going to learn what the sovereign actors are going to, do in terms of, are they going to try and collude? Are they compromised agents? Will Bitcoin become a tool for currency wars? We're going to cover all of that, and we're going to see what happens with all these different attack vectors. We'll learn from everything. And that is the way that Bitcoin was designed. And despite the fact that people will try and gaslight you into taking one part of the ecosystem and claiming that Bitcoin is centralized because they don't understand all the parts of the ecosystem. And when there is a hijack operation, which their project that they're probably shilling is not even worth hijacking because nobody cares about it, and it is already hijacked because it's so centralized, we know that they're just trying to push you in a certain direction, and you have the information you need to make better decisions. Because there are going to be people just like Mike Hearn that left the project and went to work for the banksters. And I think he sold all his Bitcoin, or he said he was going to sell it at $300 when he was saying, when he couldn't get KYC coin, or he thought it was too centralized in China, or he thought it was big blocks, whatever the debate may be. And I remember Vinny Lingham saying that he sold all his Bitcoin at $1,000 because he didn't get his big blocks and went over to the Bitcoin Cash debate. We've seen all these stories, and people will go crazy, and we will see exactly what happens, because Bitcoin at the end of this will be stronger. In fact, we have already seen that some of this, and paying attention to this, has already had a better impact in terms of developing. There is a core developer who was a maintainer, and her name was Gloria Zhao. Gloria Zhao basically revoked her PGP signing key. And people were questioning whether her ideology was deeply in line with Ethereum and her connections, because she had a relationship with Peter Todd. This is public information, who at one stage may have been hijacked because his ideology is so far from what I know as the Bitcoin ideology. He doesn't have his PGP key. Did he give it to his girlfriend in order to covertly influence and try and hijack? Well, it turns out that she ended up getting pressured out of this because people were unearthing what they believed to be a potential attack vector and compromise. Adam Back hasn't contributed code, but we revealed what we know, and he has to answer to the connections of fundraising for Blockstream and the alleged evidence from the Epstein files that Jeffrey Epstein was trying to network and bring the co-founders of Blockstream onto the island. There, is that good for Bitcoin, bad for Bitcoin if we don't get an explanation? Well, that's what an open source boardroom where there are multiple attempts to try and hijack and infiltrate is about. The end of this, we're all going to be smarter. And that's the whole time. We need all these different attack vectors to be understood so that when they are attacked from bigger and larger forces, we've already got the exact process that happens. We already know what the threats are, how we gain power, and how we use these different parts of the ecosystem to ensure that Bitcoin maintains and gives us the ability to own our own money, spend our own money, and have a monetary policy that will only ever have 21 million Bitcoin. If they are telling you for the 56,000th time in the 15 years that I've been involved in Bitcoin every single day, that this time is different and this time Bitcoin is going to die, you can go to Bitcoin Habituaries, which is a website that lists all the times when people list that Bitcoin is about to die. It won't. We need to understand the attack vectors. People are always trying to hijack Bitcoin, and we will write, and we are going through the next chapter and the next book that will be written of what happened and what we learned from this based upon this new vector and these new hijacking operations, that none of them are able to hijack Bitcoin. And we'll cover everything on Simon Dixon Live. And so, as a reminder, if you joined this halfway through, I really want you, if you care about Bitcoin, to go through all three parts and go back to this. Maybe you've been a trooper and you watched it right from the beginning. Because in part one, we covered was Bitcoin hijacked and all the different infiltration operations, and explain them in the context of whether Bitcoin was actually hijacked or not, so that you can understand the structure. In part two, I had a debate with the author of Hijacking Bitcoin, where I debated Steve Patterson on whether Bitcoin or Bitcoin Cash had infiltration operations. And we debated the nature of what these hijacking attempts may mean for Bitcoin and whether you should leave the project or continue to be a part of the project. And in the third part, in part three, we brought it to today and we went through, is Bitcoin Knots a hijack operation? Is Bitcoin Core a hijack operation? And is this the next phase of Bitcoin's governance war? And whether Core V30 is a hijack or BIP 110 is a hijack? And the answer is everybody will try to hijack Bitcoin, and consensus rules. And we will have times when we are more centralized at each attack vector, and we need to react and we need to adjust. But you ain't getting another Bitcoin again. This is the only project you will get. And everybody that tries to create the cheaper, faster, better Bitcoin goes down in shitcoin history as the person that failed to hijack Bitcoin and ended up with something else connected to Silicon Valley, central banks, Wall Street, intelligence operations, Epstein networks, whatever it may be. We've seen it time and time again. And this obviously will make Bitcoin can be used to make the financial industrial complex and the proof of weapons network more resilient and more powerful, only if you hold it with them in custody. So what do? We boycott the Federal Reserve by owning Bitcoin and not a shitcoin. We boycott BlackRock by owning Bitcoin in self-custody rather than a Bitcoin ETF. We boycott the banks by not borrowing against our Bitcoin and instead not mining fiat currency, holding it in self-custody and becoming a long-term investor that owns more Bitcoin this month than the previous month, rather than falling for all the trading operations. We boycott the global institutions that are engaged in centralizing stable coins into a 1984 Orwellian nightmare integrated with social credit score and artificial intelligence by the PayPal mafia, Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, and David Sachs, by investing in decentralization and looking at participating in the debate and running our own nodes if we want to actually have a say in maintaining decentralization. And we boycott the large institutions by focusing on community, on local, our own sovereign setups, our companies remaining sovereign from the attack vectors, and then maybe you might have a role in politics in order to remain that those countries remain more sovereign. But recognize that it doesn't scale. So you end up having community, local spending of your money, local community payment networks. And Bitcoin is a great tool for people to build a longer term plan and boycott the system. So always remember, you are alive at one of the most interesting, crazy, and exciting times in financial history. Most are going to get wrecked. Others are going to do very well. I'd like you to be on the right side of this change. And if you want to remain on the right side of this change, then please share this content with as many people as possible. We've got the long form content. We'll turn it into blogs. We'll create shorter AI consolidated content to make it more accessible. And I think my light has just blown out, which is telling me it's time to go. So let's do this with peace, love, and unity. And I will see you this time next week. Peace.